Hello, everyone. Hello, how are we doing? How is the world? Today, we are doing What If the French Navy Had Left France and Carried on the Fight in 1940, as proposed by Daniel Freeman, presented by Dr. S. Clarke, and it's on the 22nd of September, 2022. So there's a lot of twos going on here. A lot of twos. Hello, Carl Gasberg. Hello, Peter Dawson, Roland Cash. Hello, Albazaski. Hello, John Shea. Hello, John Sykes. Hello, George Newman, DH89. Hello, Stafford. Hello, Dan. Good job, you and Dan's here. You know, nice way he should be here to referee the one he suggested. Hello, HMS Verdun. Hello, Tanya Velika. Hello, George Newman. I think I said hello. Nice to go, everyone. Hello, everyone. The bot radar, I'm sure, is up. Everyone is happy. And, well, we are starting. Now, I am saying this proviso that, well, proviso that the lovely people who owe me money, who are supposed to be sending me a paycheck this week, actually pay it. There'll be three things happening. Proviso, if the paychecks come through. A, the computer will be built. That should be built because the paychecks are required to do that should come through, is pretty much guaranteed. So the new computer will be built. So I will have an auto-focusing camera for starters. That will stop this being quite so weird. And hopefully have a better mic. And hopefully it will have, of course, it will have a lot more RAM. It will have a lot more, have an actual proper graphics card and all those things. So hopefully things will get better image and sound-wise. And I'm just doing this announcement here while I'm letting everyone actually get here because I realized I hadn't actually saved the updated name of this live when I did it earlier today, so sorry. Second thing that's hopefully going to happen if the paychecks all arrive is I will be going on a little trip in November, so there'll be 2 weeks of me wandering in November. There will be details, especially of the second week, because the second week will be a research week. The first week is because hopefully, and this is the thing I'm actually have to admit I'm most worried about. As some of you will know, that there have been some issues going on with my mum and sister's breathing due to, let's put it this way, I'm not sure where it's coming from. I have suspicions, but I cannot prove it. There is some smells, and someone seems to be putting some chemicals down in their garden, which appears to be triggering their asthma and making them ill. My mum's had 3 asthma attacks this week. So, yeah, I'm hoping to get them away as soon as I can functionally afford to for a week away, because it helped when they were in Cornwall. It will hopefully help to get them away again. So that's what's happening. And the reason I'm telling you that is because, A, when I'm on the research week, if I get to go, I will be telling people where I am if they want to come and say hello to me, because I'll be doing some very cool research, because I'm doing some research into Winston Churchill for a little paper I'm writing, so I'm going to be heading off in the direction of Blenheim. And so I'll be in that part of the country having fun and probably pottering around to a couple of other archives in that area, because if I'm doing a week away, I can do more than one archive. And also, as I said, a week away for the girls, so because my sister can only take off a week because of her teaching, and therefore there will be another continuation of the series I've already been doing. In that, I thought, as the 19th century cruisers have proved quite popular, I thought I would take requests as to what 19th century cruisers you might like the next batch to be on for that period. So those 2 weeks would be another set of 19th century cruisers. I think I managed to do roughly 13 videos for the first set. And so if you have class of 19th century cruisers you'd be interested in, if under the proviso that I do actually go away, I will do those again as cover to make sure there are videos, even if I am in a place which has terrible, terrible internet signal, which seemed actually to prove out as an idea while I was in Cornwall. Anyway, hello everyone, and hello Glyn, and hello Furry Kitten, and hello everyone else who's got it. And right then, as I said, Ted Roy, hello, and Mikey Newman, and Just Funk, hello, and Rob Smith, hello. Hello Roland Cash, hello MC Legend 13H, and hello DH89. So yes, more like the camera is shaking. Possibly it is. It's as firm as it can be in the position it's in. You already wrote the book you needed a late 19th century cruiser info for, Glenn. That's good. Well, I might add in some 20th century cruisers as well, but we'll leave that one side. Hello, Darius. Hello, Gogolanda. Hello, everyone. Right then. So today's is a fun topic. And I have put these on roughly 10 minutes. Actually, no. I've given them 720 seconds roughly. So 12 minutes each for each slide. And the reason I've done that is because I see this as being, and I'm going to give people a heads up if they're watching this, a very discursive live. Because it's a what if. I am going to doing a long patrol that will go with it, that will come out on Saturday. But this is going to be quite a discursive live. Because it's quite an interesting topic about what might happen. I already know there are some of you who've got questions and ideas about what things you think might happen. I'm probably going to make some of you happy. I'm also going to make some of you very unhappy. And for those who've been watching the various things about Soviet cruisers, you will see that I still have the Soviet books out, and I have more Soviet books coming, which is... Soviet naval history is an expensive habit to get into, I will warn you now. So if you enjoy the videos, enjoy them. But be very careful about getting a desire to start looking for the books. Because... How-wee! So... Now, honestly, 96831, I have managed to avoid Gen Sul entirely. That's basically my theory, is we just we consider it in a level at which we don't involve individuals like Gen Sul. Because if you make it entirely about Gen Sul, then we will spend the entire time discussing Gen Sul. Glen Street, you brought the one director that got republished. Yes, that's a good one. That one I've got as well somewhere. But no, there are Russian the Russian books are interesting. Hello, Gilio. Italian Military Archives is here. So, you're going to enjoy this one because this one changes a few things for you guys. Loving ye olde shelf of brewer stern of you. Yes, that is to go eventually up on my wall as a giant iron brew bottle display. As I've said before, that is the plan. But it's going to be something that I can build when I don't have family members keep having asthma attacks. My life is a lot easier when I do not get phone calls and in about the middle of the afternoon, which has either got my mum keeling over or my sister keeling over with an asthma attack. It's fun times, but that will be done. That will be done. Yeah, sacrificing my wallet. That is what it felt like. Yeah, Stalin is the about. I still honestly hold this book up and go to people. If you want something which is a reasonable price book, an introduction to what the Soviet Navy was planning, then this is the book to go with, Stalin's Ocean-Going Fleet. Because all the others, they literally make my hand shake. They are that expensive. I've got some around here. Mm, no, I'm not going to get them out and show them off too much, but yeah, they are expensive. Although I have other things like this is the Imperial Museum Sea Power Victory book, Sea Power and Victory. But if I quickly do this little booklet I found in a second-hand store while I was in Cornwall, and yeah, I swear there are pictures in here which haven't been seen in years. Really not been seen in years. I need to move for this properly. It's just interesting what they get up to. It's a cool book. Well, cool little sort of thing. Don't ask. Marion, please stop adding things to my to be read pile. I like adding stuff to your to be read pile. I'd say of books I've received recently, this is going to be one which is going to get a lot of attention. William Smith's book, Churchill's Arctic Convoys. It's good. But no. Today, as said, is the French Navy. And whilst I'm not on theoretically a timer, there is always the timer of, well, I'm not sure if my sister's home yet, and that means if my mother has another asthma attack, I am charging off to deal with it. That was one reason why I was giving an explanation of my entire week. So you know what happens if I get a phone call and I charge out the door without telling you. That's what I'm running for. But my sister is supposed to be home in 10 minutes, so we should be okay. So, what if history disclaimers? As always, whenever I do what if history, I give you some disclaimers. First of all, why do what if history? Because this one always comes up. It was proposed by a patron and voted for by more patrons, so it's obviously of interest. That's my first reason. And if there's a historical discussion which is of interest to people, I'm happy to go there and talk about it and discuss it, where I have knowledge and where I can provide an interesting session. Because the point of historians is, one, to do research, two, to pass on the information, and you research, and it's doing two. A large part of doing two is going to where the people are, where people are interested, and then leading them from there to other areas. That is how you do it. You don't sit there, in my opinion, shouting and screaming and going, "This is my area, you should be interested in it." No, it's far easier to go to the area they're already interested in, and go, "Well, this is interesting, da, 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 and this then relates to this and this and this, and then we can end up here." And that is how you get lots of people interested in travel class destroyers when what they were really interested in was HMS Warspite. Works. Anyway. Secondly, you can't go too far in these things. You have to make it sensible. And where I'm sort of drawing things in is, I'm leaving it up, and I'm going towards a period of history up until roughly the end of 1941. I'm not attempting to go further than that, because honestly, you can't really predict further than that, because it's when Japan gets involved in the war, and that's going to change things again. Thirdly, as said, I love historical debates. Finally, this is all mostly my opinion, based upon reading my reading of primary, secondary, and a few tertiary sources. No one else is to blame if you don't like it. It's all on me. And thanks to nailhistory.net for the list of where the French fleet were, because I was trying to use various other sources, and then they're all disagreeing with each other, And so I went to navalhistory.net because they're the one which you can all access, all get easily. And I thought if I use that as the basis, I'm not too far wrong. It isn't an interest in HS Warfighter Spy, it's a love affair, yes. There's also, this is because these books are made of Stallium Lie, the ships and tanks and grains. Add to the human cost of all those gulag presses chopping down Stallium trees for the books, and you get dollars. Hmm. That is why you do armchair admirals. Yeah, that is literally. This is the debate, and do have this on the What If histories, and I have this when I go to interviews sometimes, and I have this in academic conferences. There is a very strong debate about whether or not you should engage and whether you should take part in these things. My view is you take part, you get involved, and you go and talk to the people and get them interested in history. Um, I can understand those who view that it should be for people to come to them. I can understand their viewpoint. Mosquito, you will die. Sorry. I got it. Closing the window now. And yes, if you haven't noticed, hooray and up she rises today. So yes, I am wearing my Port Isaac t-shirt. But it's a case of I can understand where they're coming from because there is a certain level of historical debate where when you are talking in these mediums, you can never be as fulsome or as well. You can deliver a certain level of nuance, a certain level of context, but you can't deliver the same level as you would in a book. Okay, you can't be as precise and as detail specific, which does lead you open to sort of debates and people going, well, you didn't cover this. Well, there's a time limit, there's engagement limit, there's a display limit, and there's other things I want to talk about, so there's a limitation. I can understand all that, but my view is it's better to get people interested and then tell them to go where to go out and find more than to go, well, because I can't give you everything, I shouldn't do it. But I can understand the debates. Right. Ingenious Iron, would there be enough resources to maintain another country's entire navy? Supplying, maintaining, crewing another navy in World War seems to be a big investment when supplying your own. Well, for starters, my presumption is A, the crews go with them, the ships, and I will say that. Two, the British do that to an extent, and you have to remember the British have access to Canada, they have access to the resources of the Commonwealth, of the Empire, of the Dominions, of the Commonwealth, and various other points. And they also have America's supplies, so yeah, they can do it. It's a case of the value of it is worth it enough that they would do it. Mister, I realize that my problematic favorite isn't Hood. It's just straight up battlecruisers. Why are you being buzzed by World War II wooden monoplanes? Hmm. Yeah, if Warspite had been present in Mesopotamia, none of the French fleet would have survived to join the Free French Navy. If Warspite had been available at Mesopotamia, there would have been far more downrange going on, because if Warspite was there, that means Cunningham would have been there. And if Cunningham had been there, that means it's going to be a big battle. That Crandall, it's crop of francophones to help liaison work. Actually, don't take this the wrong way if there's anyone French Canadian watching. I would have to say, I have never seen more. Uh, how do I put this? More colourful language used than when there was a debate between someone who was French Canadian and someone who was French over the correct phraseology for something. Now, admittedly, they are a married couple, but I can tell you now, if they're ever they live in the UK, and if they lived in either France or in Canada, I think there will be a non-stop war and bloodshed over the pronunciations of things, because I love them dearly. They're two of my two really cool people to know and really cool friends. But the French Canadian lady uh, is very, very sure she is right, because that's how French Canadians do pronounce it and work it through it. And their version of French, I would say, is very much rooted in about the 17th, 18th century France. And there is the modern French. And it gets interesting. Quebecois is it's interesting. Anyway, we'll leave that to one side. Hello, Don Giovanni. And John Sykes. I think I said hello. Seneca, hi. So, the French Navy in 1940. Where are they? Well, they're spread out around the world, but mostly they're concentrated in the Mediterranean and on the Atlantic and Channel coasts of France. They are in some quite interesting places. If you think about it, they are in some very useful and very interesting places. If you have these bases, if you have these things there, they are very helpful. H. remembers from the from tour that the French have to go to a Canadian French module if they want to study in Quebec. Yeah. Caroline, wouldn't have a modernized hood in Maison Quebec mean even more trouble for French? Well, under both the scenarios we're looking at today, Maison Quebec would not have happened. But in the scenario, basically any of the modernized battleships, and especially if you'd had some of the bigger ships there, if the Royal Navy had been able to plan more for Maison Quebec and therefore had reacted with a more prepared force, more organized force, it would have been pretty scary. But they weren't there for that. You have to remember, the Royal Navy wasn't turning out to carry out Maison Quebec. They were turning up to hope to talk the French into, well, preferably sailing to Martinique, or, carrying on fighting alongside the British. Admirable, was it known with any certainty which ship fired a 15 shell Maison Quebec that proved fatal for Bretagne? It was the first two hits to be fatal, if memory serves me. There is a debate. I'm not, again, I'm avoiding that. I've done enough videos on Maison Quebec to know what happens when I talk too much about Maison Quebec. And that's not today's major focus. Casablanca and Dakar would be very, very handy. Yes, there are lots of bases here which would be incredibly handy to have. Let's be honest. Having those are very, very useful. Dakar, very useful. Tahiti wouldn't be too bad either, mainly as a holiday spot, but I'm fairly sure that Tahiti being on side is quite nice. You also notice the French have rather a large number of bases. The French are therefore quite sufficient in terms of infrastructure, and they have a lot of bases on the Atlantic coast. This is important to remember. France already has infrastructure there that the Germans will take advantage of. So I have divided today into two scenarios, which I'll explain later. My point is, Warspite makes 25 knots and Strasbourg ran away, but with Hood, the point is, with Warspite there, would Strasbourg have made it out to sea? Would it have Strasbourg have made it to a point at which he could have got up to speed? But let's be honest, any modernized Queen Elizabeth would probably have that chance. It's all there. Hmm. So this is where the French Navy is around the world, and you'll be seeing these names come up in this discussion. Johnson, if they had joined the Allies, how would they have handled the resupply issue? After all, the rounds will eventually run out, and different standards they are in on US forces. Well, they've probably been upgraded to 20 and 40mm, the same as the Allies, same as the Americans and Brits did. So the light, in terms of light munitions, that's probably fine. The Americans were already getting orders to build some French munitions, so probably they could have supplied some of us. But also 6-inch, 8-inch gun shells they can probably manage. With the larger guns, that's more complicated for battleships, but battleships fire their guns less often. And again, if you're going to keep a battleship in service, you're going to nice way it's worthwhile producing the shells for it. 9681. Don't jump ahead, is what I will say on French Indochina. Don't jump ahead. We will have that discussion later. Hi, RG. Right. So here is what they have in Atlantic ports. And it's worthwhile considering what they have in Atlantic ports. Would the RN sent them to be based out of French Indochina to bolster Far East Command? We will discuss this. We will discuss all the things that they could variously do. Now, in Cherbourg, they had 2 battleships, 3 large destroyers, 3 destroyers repairing, and 5 torpedo boats, and 4 submarines. Now, I've just called all submarines SS. I haven't bothered to try and divide them up into various different things. I'm just using SS for a submersible ship because I can. Right in Brest, we have 1 battleship under construction, 1 large destroyer damaged, 2 destroyers damaged, 1 torpedo boat repairing, and 20 submarines in repairing refitting. Lorient, we have 1 large destroyer repairing. Saint-Nazaire, battleship under construction. Jean Bart. And by the way, the battleship under construction at Brest is Reclus. La Palisse, we have a destroyer. Casablanca, well, then we have 2 submarines and 3 sloops. Dakar, we have 2 submarines, 1 armed merchant cruiser, and 1 sloop. And Martinique, we have 2 light cruisers, 3 armed merchant cruisers. Dundee in Scotland, we have a submarine. And at Halifax in Canada, we have an aircraft carrier and we have a light cruiser. No worries, Stafford. The French need a lot of bases of strategy to spread the blocking fleets thin enough so they can scuttle between them and reduce the chance of ships joining the RN. Yeah, that was always a fun point of that. Hello, Amelia. Question. Hi, everyone. Question for Dr. Clarke. Would it have been better for the French to have 4 Richelieu? I think it'd been better for them to have 4 Dunkirks. We'll leave that to one side. That's a discussion point, but I think they could have built the Dunkirks quicker, and the Dunkirks were pretty darn useful vessels. I might have designed Dunkirks to be able to be upgraded with better guns when the time came. So if they could have been upgraded to the Richelieu guns, then they'd have been in a better position. Dan Freeman, the purchase of Louisiana being largely funded by British, from what I understand. Yes. British banks gave the Americans money to give the French money to purchase Louisiana, which Napoleon planned to use the money to fund his army to invade Britain. And I think the Royal Navy captured quite a lot of money on its way back to France. Or something like that. There is a reason I have listed Byrne as a CVE. I have listed her as an escort carrier, not anything else. But she would have been useful as an escort carrier. I've put her there as basically a continuation of Argus. And my theory is probably the French would find themselves turned over to, here is a swordfish, learn how to fly it, quite quickly in terms of the escort carrier role, because the British could sustain that. So, there are some interesting points here. The first point is this. If the French Navy does decide to go to Britain, what are the odds they'll end up fighting Frenchmen? Now, there is a reason I'm saying this. Because if the French Navy takes all the working ships they can with them and all the naval crew they can with them, overloading their ships with as many people as they can to get out of France, so as many soldiers, as many civilians, as many sailors as they can get to get them out of France, to get to Britain to form a sort of war economy, and there are no French ships left behind working, well, the odds of a French ship fighting another French ship, even in the Atlantic, are very, very low. And if the French do return and are taking part in, let's say, a D-Day style operation, then they're returning as liberators. They're returning to liberate France. So that's the scenario you're dealing with. The whole point here is the French Navy will act as one. It will either all go or none of it will go. And that's the point. There were a few dribs and drabs which did end up going over to the Allies. They were very small. The vast majority of the fleet acted as one. So, you have this scenario that if the French Navy decides to support, and I'm not getting into the werewolves of, the good for or against, I'm saying if they do, then they'll all go. So the idea that you would have the French fighting other French at sea, not going to happen. Are you going to have French Air Force maybe attack the French Navy as they try to go? I don't think so. And the Vichy French Air Force, I don't see getting involved that much to attack them. And I see many of them probably going as well. So you could end up with a lot of Vichy French pilots and aircrew turning up loaded with fitters in their planes as descending into airports, into airfields in the UK as well. So it is a scenario that you have to consider, but the likelihood is very, very small. So we don't need to worry about that too much. How bad for the Free French was the disappearance of Zherkov? It was a emotional and psychological problem more than an actual operational one. Look, RG, the burn is there because if you see that sailing, it actually, disturbingly, the burn's probably quite good for being an escort carrier because, honestly, it's actually got quite good protection against torpedoes from a certain perspective. Come on, husband. Byrne gets a lot of flack for not being a good carrier. Was she a passable sea boat? Let's put it this way. She was passable in that she stayed afloat and roughly in the position she was aiming to be in. Thurican, hopefully a naval officer less objectionable than de Gaulle would lead the Free French from the start. That would most likely be it. If it's the French Navy which mostly escapes, with some of the Air Force and some of the Army, whatever they cover out, then it's more than likely the French Navy which provides the leader of the Free French. Now, please note, there is a thing here that there is roughly 29 submarines. Now, if you have those 29 submarines join with the Royal Navy submarines in doing more of a blockade of the German and French, the German, Norwegian ports, etc., along with the Polish and the other Free French forces, that's going to have an impact on German operations. That's a big boost in submarine numbers. It's going to affect their surface ship operations because this is already after the Germans have lost their destroyers at Narvik. Okay? So the Germans are already short on escorts. Any more submarines you have in that operation is just going to make their lives that much more difficult. And French submarines are good. Okay, they have some very interesting designs, but they are very good technologically wise. They are good submarines. Hi, Martin. Strong does see if the French Navy had gone, would it have made an Operation Dynamo situation possible where the French Air Force and land forces fought on while evacuation got as many fighting men out of the country? More than likely. They would have probably been part of Dynamo's evacuation. Aaron Contreras, sounds about right, to be honest. TUS needed catapults to launch off escort carriers. Yes. And it won't exist. The TBF doesn't exist 19 yeah in this scenario we're going to be ending the discussion in the 1941, so Avenger doesn't really matter to us. Edge of London, 29 submarines. Does Rommel even get to Egypt? We haven't got on to the Mediterranean. We have got onto the North Atlantic. This is the Atlantic. I have answered about the disappearance of Surkov. Right. This is the Mediterranean and North Africa. Where is the French Navy here? Well, in this force, they have 5 battleships. They have a seaplane carrier. They have 8 heavy cruisers, 6 light cruisers, 2 armed merchant cruisers, 24 large destroyers, 18 other destroyers, 6 torpedo boats, 45 submarines, and 9 sloops. This is the force which largely Force H comes into existence to try and mitigate the loss of. This is what Force H is, to try and mitigate the loss of. This is the reality you have to think about. Force H is an ongoing commitment. As was said last night when Drakenfell and Gilia on Italian Military Archives were having their wonderful live last night, and their discussion, something which I hope to do one day once I've got the tower unit working. I have other guests on to do lives and discussions. I've tried it on this laptop, it just don't work. This is what Force H has to replace. This is why the Royal Navy has to put so much force into the Mediterranean, because they were designed pre-war around the idea they were going to provide the Mediterranean fleet, which would be one end of the Mediterranean, and the French would be the other end of the Mediterranean. When you lose the French, you have to supply Force H. 5 battleships. Yes, they're not all modern, beautiful units, but they're still battleships. And let's be honest, that's a force which changes things. If we consider, if you've got the French 5 battleships and the British battleships as well, I have managed to put in 5 battleships as well, you would have 10 battleships. Now, some of them could be good, some of them could be not. Some of them might be modernized and very capable ships, some of them might be less modernized capable ships. But if you ended up in a fight versus the Italian Navy, if you have 10 battleships, the Italian 6 suddenly look in a far bigger, far more dangerous space. Whereas when you consider when the British with Force H, etc., there usually have 6, 7, it's suddenly far more even. Then, and everyone, the point about this whole idea is that the French Navy was really significant force and good capabilities at this point in history, so could have a big impact. Yep. So it doesn't. Would the Kriegsmarine even try to get raiders out without with that much support? They would probably still try because they have to try because Hitler insists they try. But that's going to be a big difference. And again, here, I said, there are now, we'd be talking about 45 more submarines in the Mediterranean. 45 more submarines in the Mediterranean. One thing, don't know if this has been covered, but no need for Force H. We'll be getting into that, what the consequences for no Force H, etc., and what exactly happens around that. Most of the old Italian ships aren't that spectacular, so the French ones can be quite useful against them unless you run into a Littorio. Exactly. Where numbers hopefully help. It was a good one. But these forces, where are they based at? Well, a big section are based at Toulon, but Algeria has them based in Iran and in Algiers. There's Bizet, Tunisia. There's Sousse, Tunisia. There's Beirut. There's Alexandria in Egypt. So, yeah, the big chunk at the beginning are the ships based in actual France itself. So, how much of that you get out of France depends on your perspective. But the fact is, the battleships, they're in Algeria and Alexandria. The heavy cruisers, they're in Beirut and in southern France. They are able to be moved, is what I'm saying. And then the rest of the world, where do they have? Well, this is the French Empire and the British Empire in the 1920s. Just so you can see where they sort of interact. And you might already be noticing something interesting going on here because the Italian Empire in North Africa suddenly looks a lot less secure when you don't have the French Empire in North Africa backing it up. Doesn't it? The French have another light cruiser over in Saigon. They have some sloops. They have some armed merchant cruisers. And they have some gunboats. This is not many ships. They're not really that many ships. But it doesn't matter. Those 3 French super dreadnoughts we had a disadvantage against the Littorio. Yes, but the odds are, would those 3 French super dreadnoughts be taking on a Littorio 1v1? In any... Is there any circumstance where the Allies would be aiming for a 1v1 of a French super dreadnought versus Littorio? Or would they be aiming for a battle of, let's say, 3 super dreadnoughts versus a Littorio? This is the point I think it's worthwhile making. On paper, you can go, well, these ships are not as good as the newest Italian ships, etc. Doesn't really matter because, yes, they're not as good, but no one's going to aim for a scenario. It's like saying, well, the R-class wouldn't be want you would fight to the Littorios. No, you wouldn't want to take an R-class versus the Littorio. But the R-class, if you did find them fighting Littorio, would probably be there with most of their battle squadron, in which case there'd be 3 or 4 R-class there. In which case, the Littorio probably can sink one of them, but will it sink all 4? Probably not. It will have to keep away from them. It'll either have to run away, or it will get severely beaten up. Mike Newman, could the French fleet have stopped the fall of Crete? We'll be getting into all these things. So we'll be discussing this as we go on. I don't want to answer too many questions now because we've got 2 scenarios to go for, and if I've answered all the questions, then I've got nothing to talk about. Wayne, again, I'm not jumping into talking about the specific scenarios. I'm giving you an outline of the French Navy right now. I'll be getting into them. Amelia Barrow, could the French Troubadours be equal to the older Italian battleships? They could certainly have a chance versus them. It's like the R class. They have a chance. But again, you wouldn't want it to be in a one-on-one fight. But that's the point. If you have the French having 5 battleships, the British having 5 or 6 battleships, what are the odds that the Italians with 6 battleships end up in a scenario where it's a 1v1 fight? Madam Peacock, with the French fleet, the Allies get to really play number games. No more spreading ships around Finn, you go for strength in numbers. Pretty much, that's what he's doing. And nice one. You wouldn't want to take a Hood against a Bismarck. You would take taking Hood against Bismarck again was part of a group. She was there with the Prince of Wales. Again, it wasn't sending a battle cruiser versus a battleship. It was sending a battleship, a new battleship, which wasn't worked up, and a very worked up battle cruiser versus a battleship. That was what the calculation was. If things had worked out even slightly differently in terms of Prince of Wales operating capacity and the lucky BB, then we probably wouldn't be remembering the Battle of Denmark Straits like we are today. Denmark Straits would have been an as expected, the Bismarck is sunk, or runs off home, and yeah, it will be forgotten. H1, all those friendships means you might be able to get the KGVs out to Med to fight Liz Warriors. If we need to. Right then. Not quite half an hour. We'll be getting into them soon. But I do keep getting flashes of high CPU usage, so I apologize now. Right then. So, what are the 2 scenarios? Well, I thought I would group together the entire force you've got roughly available. You have roughly available 7 battleships. Roughly 7. And please note, I'm saying roughly 7 for the French Navy. I've gone through this list of the ships and where they are. There are various discussions on where they are and what they're going to be. The battleships in Oran are Dunkirk, Strasbourg, and Bretagne and Provence. The battleship in Egypt is Lorraine. And the battleships in Cherbourg are Colbert and Paris. So, yeah, not the most capable ships in the world, but they're there. So, there are 7 battleships. There is an escort carrier. There is a seaplane carrier. There are 8 heavy cruisers. There are 9 light cruisers. There are 29 roughly, 10 light cruisers, 29 large destroyers, 24 small destroyers, 12 torpedo boats, a nice 16 sloops. Submarine terms, there is 74 subs. of various types, 4 gunboats, and there's even some armed merchant cruisers. So I think there's about 7 of those wandering around. That is actually quite a significant force if you add it into the whole naval picture. In 1940, that's a blooming useful naval force. Because whilst those battleships might or not always be that amazing, those battleships could take on escort duties with convoys because, let's be honest, they're not great. The Bismarck or anything would win in a fight versus them, but they take damage. And as I've been over before many times, the whole thing about a battleship in a surface raider scenario is it doesn't want to take damage, because the moment it gets damaged is the moment it has trouble. Now, that's life of it. So the battleships are useful. They're still useful as heavy escorts. They could be doing things like being in the Indian Ocean. Then you have some modern battleships. They're fast battleships. Where would they be used? Probably be used in the Mediterranean. They'd probably be doing the Force H role. In which case, you don't have Britain having to supply the Force H role, which means Britain probably is able to put some ships into maintenance and repair and refit. Maybe even Hood goes in for her refit as scheduled because they can afford to. Because instead of them being versus the 4 German and 6 Italian, 11 battleships, and British having roughly 15, 16 available, the British would be going, well, hang on, there's roughly 23 available. Well, that makes life a little bit easier. You can afford to have one go off and do something else. The main limitations you have here, though, are carriers. The French do not bring a carrier to the thing that's useful. Yes, they have an escort carrier. So, yes, the Burn might well be used to provide helping bridge the Mid-Atlantic gap. It might take on a sort of Argus and, well, to an extent, Argus and Furious role. It could well be used supporting, straddling those duties. Do I consider it particularly good? No, but is that going to help? Probably yes, because if you got Swordfish out there earlier, taking part in the anti-submarine operations and convoy protection in the Mid-Atlantic, that's probably going to cost the Germans some of their earlier experienced crews, which is going to have an impact. We'll get into all this. All this is a force which has an impact. Now, the 2 scenarios. Free French Navy, basically the Navy, instead of agreeing to terms, leaves the French force and fights from colonies and British ports. France fights on. Now, I've already had a comment from Knight 681. You're going to have to explain the logic of number 2, as the Eiffel Tower will survive unless the bomb hits the observation deck and kills a load of French civilians. The thing is, I don't really have to explain logic. Don't take this the wrong way. I was thinking about a scenario where France decides to fight on. There are many options to pick from. I just picked a random one because I decided to do my usual thing of using Goring as a bit of a shtick. And he jumps into a Ju-87 and he manages to golden BB the Eiffel Tower. That's it. He managed to golden BB one of the supporting struts of the Eiffel Tower, and in a stiff breeze, it blows over. There you go. It doesn't really matter about the reality of that one. What matters is France fights on. So instead of France surrendering, becoming Vichy France, etc., the French realize the Germans have got to the end of their logistics. The French are being decided not to give in because of the huge affront to France done while negotiations were going on, and the people demand they fight on so they can carry on fighting. And therefore, you've got the fact that the German army is at the end of their logistics train. You've got the British army being redeployed into southern ports to go and support in the second BEF. And probably more British troops will be sent there. So you've got an ongoing fight going on in France. That is the joy of it. Rather not nice sort of French soldiers or French civilians involved in it, but that's the whole thing of what's going on. MC Legend 38. Wouldn't Hood have a slightly larger task force this time if there's all these French ships? What you're probably looking at is with no Force H is there's more likelihood of ships going in for refit, so Hood might have been refitted. It might not have had the full massive refit plan, but it might have had its engines, etc., refitted, and may even have had some armor, etc., and things put in. There are all sorts of options for what the British might have done in terms of refitting, but again, you have less force. So the odds are no, the French ships, and I'm going to explain this right now. The odds are no, there are no French ships up in the North Sea. There are no French ships up reinforcing the British up north because the British don't need them. The British need them doing what Force H has to do, because if they're doing what Force H has to do, then Force H's ships, instead of being down being Force H, are up in Home Fleet as part of that force, or off in the Mediterranean with the Mediterranean Fleet. So if you don't have Force H in existence, if difficulties for the Navy suddenly get a lot easier, and there are other things that go on that change things as well. Good luck, Glib. Enjoy your work. Enjoy your work. Enjoy it. Good luck with the writing. Lionheart X-ray. All those destroyers would definitely help a lot plus cruisers. Yes, the destroyers would be a very big help, and the cruisers. And Arian contrast. If the French fleet remains free, does that mean the Italians surrender quicker? We'll discuss this because it does change things there. Dingy do you think the commanders of the French Navy would be too eager for battle to regain honour and revenge, possibly suffering unnecessary casualties and damage? I doubt that, as the French Navy are pretty darn professional. There might be younger captains and destroyer commanders who are like that, but as a whole, there'll be quite a sensible fleet. About the same level of aggression as you expect from Royal Navy destroyers, in other words. Gogolana, Doc, I would put the Nelrods with the home fleet in the Atlantic. And Jocelyn, you fight with what you have available, not what you have in reality. Heimann 1640, golden stiff breeze. Just damaging the Eiffel Tower would have been given enough, given how famous the sailors. Possibly, but yeah, drops a bomb on the Eiffel Tower. Amelia, I'm now managing Le Fantastique and Cossack in the charging Narvik guns losing. Well, of course, Narvik has already happened. Narvik has happened a while ago by this point, by the time France falls. Because that's April, and this is June, July 1940. But these ships will be there. Dunkirk or Rickley, paired with one or two the King George fleets on patrol in North Atlantic, would help would the Iron spare a camera as roaming patrol to respond in calls to acceptance fleet preparances? No. Because, think of it this way. Stafford, if you take Dunkirks, and the Rickaloos are still in construction, so I haven't put them anywhere, I've just left them. I haven't included them in these numbers or anything. Because you can get them out, but then you need to finish them off, so either way, even if they got out of France, they're now having to go over to America to be completed. So there is no point thinking about them, whatever. They won't be finished by the end of 1941. They might come into service in 1942. But the point is this. If you take the Dunkirks away from the fleet in the Mediterranean, then what do they have to fight the Littorios? This is the point. If you take the Dunkirks away from the French forces in North Africa, in the Western Mediterranean, that's great. You've got extra ships up in the North Atlantic to fight the Germans, but you don't need them there because you've got Renown. You've got all the other ships which aren't deployed to Force H up with the home fleet. So you don't need those ships from the France to do that because you've got the Force H ships. What you do need, though, is those French ships in the Mediterranean to deal with the Littorios. That's the point. I know it's an often dreamed of scenario, Dunkirk coming out and fighting alongside Hood or anything like that. It's a lovely scenario, but it doesn't help the British to start taking off the French ships penny packet going, we'll take you here, and we'll send a British ship down there. If they leave the French ships in French North Africa, especially the French ports, and we'll be discussing this, what happens with those French ports, then they're going to have their own infrastructure, supplies, continuous command. You leave things alone. Instead, you leave the Free French be, and basically go, right then, this is your side, Navy, we'll keep supplying you. Colin Cameron, if there is no Force H, the big question is, where does Ark Royal end? Both ends of the Suez Canal, probably. There is definitely an option of where Ark Royal would end up. I have a feeling that it might be a case of her and Illustrious swap around. That's what I have a feeling. MC Legend 13H, again, we'll be getting into that. So, let's start off with scenario 1, the Free French Navy. What does this basically mean? Well, the Free French Navy means almost exactly what it says on the tin. The Free French Navy is the Navy goes free. There is no big change. There is no big, carrying on fighting in France. It's the Navy evacuates from France as had been planned at various points with the British prior to the fall of France, and that is it. The Navy goes off and goes to fight alongside the British. They continue on fighting. Now, the question is, how does the Navy do this? Well, I have this honest suspicion that it would not be a straightforward, we're going to sail out to British ports, because whilst that would probably be the case with the ships based in France proper, the ones based in North Africa and the various colonies might well decide, hang on, why do I need to go anywhere? Because you must remember, there aren't many French army troops around, so most of the military force there is the Navy. And the army in North Africa would probably be happy to fight on, as would the army in various other parts of the world. So what you would probably see is where the French Navy are in the world in strength, those places would go Free French. To be fair, sending a couple of R's to help out with the French for a Force H makes some sense. At some point, the French ships will need refit and repair continued. So getting some of this command and control kinks worked out early makes some sense. Now, Felix, you've just asked, would they send some ships to the east? Well, we'll talk about that in a second. Under this scenario, the French have basically decided we are going to carry on fighting. The French Navy, that's what they're doing. They're continuing fighting. And as such, they are strengthening themselves up. They're positioning themselves. But most importantly, they're concentrating. Where are they going to concentrate? Well, the Toulon fleet, if they're falling back, will fall back to probably French North Africa. In which case, those will be a load of continuing on fighting, motivated Free Frenchers turning up in North Africa, which means North Africa is more than likely very quickly going to be very much Free French. Now, this automatically eliminates one thing which we haven't talked about yet, and no one's talked about. Operation Torch. Think about that. 1942, one of the big operations that year is Operation Torch. You don't need that, because French North Africa is allied with you. Also, start thinking immediately about, well, in case of the Western Mediterranean, it's the French Navy which will be providing the force. Now, they're going to be short of an aircraft carrier. With the loss of their bases in central France, yes, they're going to have air support from whatever aircraft they've managed to secure in North Africa, but they're probably going to want more aircraft, which means you are going to have some British ships have to be dispatched to assist them, but we'll get into that in a bit. But basically, this is the French admirals, whoever they may be, deciding they're going to continue fighting. And as they decide to continue fighting, they are moving out. They will base themselves from North Africa. That will become the hub of the Free French forces because that's where they can move their largest fleet. Now, the interesting question is, where do the Atlantic ships go? Do the Atlantic ships go to the UK or do they go down to North Africa? I think they would go, especially in the battleships cases, would go to North Africa. I think you might end up with some cruisers, maybe even some heavy cruisers, some of the heavy cruisers coming up and supporting the British in the North Atlantic because the British would love some more cruisers up there. They'd love the help of some French heavy cruisers up there to help with the operations they have going on. So I think those ships you might see come around. I think you might see the ships from there go up to North Atlantic. But I wouldn't be surprised if the vast majority of the French ships, barring their submarines and their sloops and destroyers, go south to the Mediterranean. So, what kind of impact is this going to have in the Battle Atlantic? Well, Force H doesn't exist, but the French probably need a carrier. Would the British really assign Ark Royal, their largest, biggest, best, and sexiest carrier, to the French? No. They're not going to. What they're probably going to send is Illustrious, or alternatively, Furious. Furious is viable as an air defense carrier. She's not amazingly useful, but she's not that bad. Remember, they've lost Glorious and Courageous already at this point. But she is still viable. She's currently sitting with Home Fleet, but you can palm her off on the French, especially as that means they're going to be doing limited operations, and Furious will be fine for them. She's still an improvement on Burn. Maybe they'd send Eagle, maybe they'd send something else, but probably Eagle's still the Mediterranean fleet and is a worked up vessel in that fleet and is considered a very reliable aircrew. Ark Royal probably goes to the Mediterranean fleet. Hey, Bejon. Now, look at this force. There is Malaya there, and there is Renown. Malaya and Renown. Well, that's an upgrade. That's a Queen Elizabeth class, and that's an upgraded battlecruiser. Well, if you don't need those for Force H, where are they going to be? They're going to be back with the with Home Fleet, aren't they? They're going to be part of the Atlantic Group, and this is the point again. You've suddenly got a lot more ships which you don't need to worry about where they are in the world because the French have got the western half the Mediterranean. Now, you've also got all those submarines, and those extra submarines along with the Royal Navy's own submarines will be causing a problem for the Germans. British submarines cause enough of a trouble going through the Denmark Straits into the Baltic, doing all sorts of naughty things in there, with French submarines backing them up, Polish submarines backing them up, operating off the coast of Norway, operating off the coast of the Netherlands, off the coast of Germany, and all these places where they've got coastal traffic. That is going to cause even more issues. 20 odd, nearly 30 submarines extra is not something you can easily go, they make no difference. They're going to make a difference. Will they have a massive difference? I'm not sure. But the fact is, with that many more submarines, if you use the 1 in 3 rule for operational generation, you've got at least 10 more subs on patrol at any one point. That's 10 more chances for a submarine to make contact with any task force which is trying to sail out to the Atlantic. 10 more chances for intelligence to be ships to be spotted, for intelligence to be gathered, for things to be detailed. That's an impact right there on the Battle Atlantic. Then you've got the French sloops. Now remember, the French were already building corvettes, building Flower-class corvettes. They're already getting involved in the Battle of the Atlantic. They expect them to continue to get involved in the Battle of the Atlantic, but also expect the French air bases and the French islands in the Caribbean, etc., to be of use. The French actually have more forces pretty much based in the Caribbean than the British do at this point. So that's going to be useful. It gives you that much of an extension of support. And there is the Burn. Now, whilst I wouldn't want to take her into the Mediterranean, the French might choose to take her in the Mediterranean, but I would reckon she'd probably start becoming the first escort carrier of the war, going along with critical convoys, providing them with swordfish anti-submarine protection. You could do that with her. And that would be a very useful use of her. And that's going to have an impact on German operations. Again, if you've got a virtual escort carrier on critical convoys already at the beginning of the war, that's going to have an impact on what happens to your other ships and to submarines and to the Germans' attempts to build up experience. But there's something else about Burn which it's worthwhile noticing. Now, the Burn, as much as I am not keen on her, and I am really not keen on her, she does have 8 single 6-inch guns. Now, why am I talking about her 6-inch guns? Because they have the ability to depress. And that means if the Burn is sitting in the center of a convoy and a German submarine does its favorite trick of trying to sail up the center of the convoy, shooting at things with its gun, its deck gun is going to come face to face with the Burn's 6-inch guns. In which case, the likelihood of survivability of that particular submarine is very, very low. In fact, I think it might be measured in seconds. Because a 6-inch shell, even if it doesn't go off when it passes through the submarine, because the submarine is that light a metal and compared to the armor a 6-inch shell is supposed to deal with, will create a very large hole, which will do 2 things. One, if it's coming in at a right angle, will let air out and water in. And that's the problem if you're a ship. Well, we always talk about the way to sink a ship is to let water in. But you also want to let the air out as well. If you can do both at the same time, you will sink a ship really quite fast. A submarine even more so, because submarines are designed to sink in the first place. So, this starts to have consequences for the Battle Atlantic. Now, under this scenario, France still, of course, concedes, and the Germans still get access to those Atlantic ports. So you are still dealing with a German naval submarine force, the Kriegsmarine, operating from the French Atlantic ports, which is not good. Let's be honest. The German submarines operating from French Atlantic ports is the major advantage they have for the Battle Atlantic. So yes, they probably lose more of their experienced submariners earlier on. And yes, it might well flatten out some of the happy times because the experience of Burn operating as an escort carrier would probably mean the desire to actually entering and construct escort carriers would receive more emphasis earlier on. All of which are reasonable things to think about and put through. But still, he says, hunting for chocolate, still, it's not going to completely erase the problem. The Germans are still going to be there. It is going to make supply, and I'm including this in the Battle Atlantic, supply of SOE slightly more interesting, because SOE in France, if you've got all these French naval personnel, is something going to be able to do a lot more probable supplies by sea. Because you think about all the harbours, bays, all the spaces those French naval personnel will know that just don't show up on maps. Even the British maps. And you also have the fact that they will have the connections with the people who probably formed SOE in the first place. This would give them an advantage in carrying out those operations. It would also limit probably a lot of the other options for the Germans as well, because the Royal Navy would now know that the Germans only have possible access to their own ships. So there's no chance of them getting the French ships. So the British don't have to factor that into their deployments. Remember, the British, until the French ships sink themselves, always have to factor into their deployments the potentiality of the Germans seizing control of French battleships, even their less capable ones, and putting them to use. If the Germans are down to just 4 based in Germany, and those 4 aren't actually ready at this point, there's 2 ready at this point. There's 1 more coming into service not that long down the way, and there's 1 more after that. This affects what the Royal Navy has to think about in terms of deployments of capital ships. Which leads us to our second potentiality. You might well see Anson and Howe get redesigned because there's less pressure for them. So whilst I think Duke of York and Prince of Wales and King George V enter sea as they are, I wouldn't be surprised if Anson and Howe get converted into 16-inch ships. Interesting thing is, if they do, you might not see HMS Vanguard built. They might put the efforts into completing those as 16-inch ships, in which case you get more effort put into more effort available instead of going into Vanguard, going into those being 16-inch ships, but also you have more stuff free in terms of yards. So you probably see a slightly enhanced carrier program on the British part, which may probably not lead to a Malta class being completed, but could well lead to some Audacious class being completed in the war in time for the war. Now, on to the next part of the discussion. The Mediterranean. Now, as most of us know, and there is always a timeline issue, so if people don't know, don't worry about it. Italy had actually declared war and joined the war before the French fell out of the war. The Italians actually started invading France because they were worried the Germans would get all the glory. We often don't talk that much about the Italian invasion of France, but it really wasn't as successful as some people would like you to make out. In fact, the Italian advance into France was actually a proof positive of the Maginot Line, in that the Maginot Line in that sort of area of France actually proved fairly successful. And if it hadn't been for the French government's sort of collapse and surrender, they could have won. They could have probably changed things. Now, the thing is, I've already discussed the fact that, and mentioned about Atlantic, that with the French battleships on the side of the British, you actually have less need for the capital ships the British were constructing. Because you have the numbers. Yes, you can still have the losses, but remember at this point, the only ship that's been lost so far is the Royal Oak. Now, if you haven't lost the French Navy, yes, you've lost the Royal Oak, but that's one of 24, not 8 of 24 ships lost. You probably your desire to build and really emphasize the build when you're faced against 10 capital ships at this point is probably not as much there. This is why I say Vanguard probably doesn't get finished, but Anson and Howe could well get completed as I would have a suspicion they might be modified. They be modified to the level that they would probably get either 9 or 8 16-inch guns in a two triple turrets and a twin turret. But I think they might try and go for 3 triple turrets and modify them a bit. Now, impact on the Mediterranean North Africa. Well, here is the interesting thing. As I've already said, in my mind, the French go to North Africa. That's where they disappear to. That's where the Free French go and operate from. So the Free French Navy would have descended en masse on North Africa. They probably already had would have probably already had a strong section there. In which case, the forces in North Africa probably go Free French. In which case, look at this map. The Italians, at that point, have a problem. Because you have Libya being attacked from both sides. Or rather, even if the Free French forces in North Africa do not move, do not go on offensive, the Italians cannot afford to ignore them. You also have a problem of resupplying them and convoying any troops out there because you have to get them past any forces of the French in Tunisia. And let's go back here and have a look at this list. This is the Mediterranean North Africa. What do the French have based in Tunisia? Wow. They have, at Bizet, they have the 8th Destroyer Division, the 12th Destroyer Division, and a commander of submarines, a Rear Admiral, the French version of Rear Admiral, Contra Admiral Sivien. And you have a total in Tunisia of 19 submarines, 2 sloops, an armed merchant cruiser, 3 torpedo boats, and 3 destroyers. Now, okay, that's not the largest force in the world, but it doesn't need to go exactly 1,000,000 miles to cause a massive trouble for trying to resupply Libya. Oh, and you also have Malta there. And suddenly, if you think about your resupply runs for Malta, where do you need to go? How do you need to get them there? Well, you get the supplies up the coast of North Africa. French take them along the coast of French North Africa, take them into a port in Tunisia, and then from Tunisia, you pulse them across to Malta, and you're there. The fact is, parts of North Africa already go Free French, French Equatorial Africa, etc. So you have this. You have Libya basically surrounded on all sides by French and British. The odds are Libya falls very quickly. There is not much chance of Libya surviving. In which case, the North African campaign is over. There is no campaign in North Africa. If you can think about that, imagine that there's no Africa Corps, which the Germans probably are happy with because it means they have more troops for the invasion of the Soviet Union. They also have Rommel around for the invasion of the Soviet Union, which is going to be fun because he grandstands like anything. But he is actually quite good at moving quickly, and who knows, he might actually prove useful in the invasion of the Soviet Union. You have a huge Italian army get captured, which is problematic for Il Duce, but you suddenly have a scenario where you have the entire North African coast is under Allied hands, which is going to affect your ideas for resupplying the Far East, for all these things, because the whole of the Mediterranean campaign has changed. Stafford, I love your idea of wouldn't they have more emphasis for airlift capacity? So jet aircraft would see faster development. No. It's a nice idea, but the reality is jets are developing about as fast as the British can develop them anyway. And you would, if you consider them on the C-130, etc., turboprop, maybe. You might see, what you would probably see is the Sunderlands, the short Sunderlands, the lovely great big flying boats would set up a service directly from Tunisia to Malta. And they'd be probably doing a round circuit almost daily. Well, no, 2 to 3 times daily. I see a large contingent of Italians ending up in Canada for a long war. Could well be. But you have now changed your scenario quite dramatically. You've also changed your scenario, if you think about it, for the invasion of Greece. Because if the North African campaign is over that quickly, then the British Army can deploy quite a large number of troops to Greece, and the French will probably go with them. Now, does this mean that Greece turns into a victory for the Allies? I'm not sure. I would honestly say that the fact is that Greeks couldn't adapt that quickly because they had advanced so successfully against the Italians, they couldn't adapt to where the Germans attacked them. If they'd had more allied forces from the British and the French, there is a potentiality that they could have reinforced those things. Hello, what are you doing here? Hmm? Hello. Yes. Yeah. Oh, good lord. Oh. So, and of course, there would have been corgis probably taking charge of everything, as we all know. Now, it's basically, this is one of those things. It's one of those scenarios which sounds really quite terrible because it changes the North African campaign because that goes, but it doesn't actually change the battle in the Mediterranean as much as you might think it does. Because the Italians and the Axis forces are now no longer having to supply ships across it. So they won't be losing the supplies, they won't be having to supply the North African campaign, so they actually have more supplies for their navy. In which case they can do operations with their navy. The trouble is, where do they go? Where would the French navy, where would the Italian Regia Marina go? They can go and support the operations off Greece, which could mean you end up with that battle which the lovely Cunningham really, really wanted. You also probably end up with Taranto taking place with HMS Ark Royal as the strike carrier, which means you might well lose more Italian battleships in that battle, or rather, Eldon barring Giulio Cesare could actually be damaged to the extent they need to be repaired. What are you up to now? You turning around so you can... Oh, you want to clean me. Okay.
What have you got on your shelf?
I think he's after the Soviet naval history books. He's decided he doesn't like communism anywhere near his home. He's very much a royalist. He doesn't like communism.
It could also be the biscuits or something. You've got cake coming.
I've got cake. Oh, I've got cheese straws.
Cheese.
Yes. He's no longer the trainee assistant fluffy research assistant. He's the assistant fluffy research assistant. He got promoted. The academic board met, and we decided he could be promoted to assistant fluffy research assistant. Now, he's a very good doggy. Now, the other thing you'll probably see in this scenario is, if you notice, there's Syria, there's various other campaigns which the British have to get involved to secure their back and worry about Vichy, what might happen with Vichy French forces if they collapsed and gave them to the Germans. So you again have a lot less commitments for the British. You have more forces and you have less commitments. More forces and less commitments. That's going to make life a lot more fun. Under this scenario, therefore, Crete probably doesn't fall, in that there are probably a lot more forces there if they do withdraw to there. But I also wouldn't be surprised if the Germans and Italians don't get to take the whole of Greece, in which case, let's be honest, we all know there are some nations which you do not want to fight a guerrilla war in them. Spain, Greece, Afghanistan, and Nepal are probably the top 4 of countries in the world you do not want to fight a guerrilla war. So good luck to the Germans and the Italians. And yes, as I mentioned, with Ark Royal as part of Mediterranean fleets, with less commitments requiring forces, Eagle's probably not as worn out. In which case, you end up with Eagle and Ark Royal probably being taking part in the Taranto raid. If you have Eagle and Ark Royal, and maybe the Eagle and Ark Royal taking part, then that's probably enough aircraft that there is a lot of damage done. So Giulio Cesare, it becomes the only Italian battleship still working. As we all know, she will never die. No matter what you do, that ship will not die. It has more plot armor than anything written by any science fiction author. It has more plot armor than freaking the Enterprise does. I don't know how. And sure, Matt, I think you've probably seen most of the Greek army getting out the French and British. A defeat, but then you would have a Greek corps in whatever offensive comes next. Oh, that is the worst case scenario, is that Greece falls and the Greek army managed to be extracted. But it's a case, again, of how much of this scenario are the Italian ships. Is there any naval force surviving to actually fight? And then you have the other problem for the Italians, because yes, their submarines are powerful and they can sink Allied ships, but why do you need large Allied ships going around if the Italian Navy isn't there, doesn't have large Allied ships, and you aren't doing massive convoys? Because you can resupply Malta quite so easily. Suddenly, the Mediterranean War, instead of becoming an attrition on British and British forces especially, and is something which they can ignore. So you probably see the British withdraw a heavy fleet, and the Mediterranean fleet would ended up being moved to the Indian Ocean, or it would at least be sitting in the Djibouti, the other end of the Red Sea. Close enough it could be called up if there was a major operation, if intelligence said that the Italians were going to do something and we needed to concentrate on it. But far enough away, they were nice and safe from the fighting and could respond to problems in the Far East. What are you planning on doing now? You taking over?
Well,
watch out, he did leave a present outside earlier, which I haven't cleaned up yet.
That'll be your task first thing in the morning then.
I was going to do it before I finished in here tonight.
We have a visitor tomorrow.
Good.
Possibly.
Oh, fun times.
I forwarded you the email. You can make your assessment.
So you either have a scenario where Greece ends up being a continual thorn in the side of Italy and Germany, where they're constantly fighting it, in which case you do have be getting supplies, etc., to Greece. But remember, those supplies would go around Africa and would come up from Egypt to Greece that way. Or you might send them along the north coast of Africa, which you now control, nicely protected by your own aircraft the whole way, able to get into ports if the Italians actually sorted whatever ships they had, and then able to go to Greece that way. Any updates on the Feral Research Assistant? The Foxy is very happy. I think I saw her the other day, so I think she's okay. And give Naomi my best, Roland. On Peacock, technically, the jets are being designed and built as fast as British submarines can do it. Had there been less official oversight, then the British could have had jets a year or two, maybe two earlier. Yeah, it's fun times. With the Allied Meadows and Allied Lake, that means everything 2 to 3 weeks faster. That's a battleship's shipping massive change. Italy might get invaded in 42, at which point, let alone the redeployment to the Far East. Well, that is the thing. If you don't have to do Operation Torch, and you don't want to invade northern France, where the Germans are, of course, very heavily committed, you could well invade Italy in 1942 instead. That could be the invasion of Italy, could be in 1942. It could be the Operation Torch could now be an invasion of Italy. But remember, I'm ending in 1941. I'm remembering ending at December 1941 because honestly, the rest of it is just. Mm. And so we get into the supercharged deterrence of the Far East. Now, what is this? What is this scenario? Well, think about it this way: if the Italians at this point, as said, you've had a Toronto take place where you've had Eagle and Ark Royal. Now that's going to be about a strike group between 3 and 4 times the aircraft which take part in Toronto. So let's say it only doubles the number of hits achieved. That's a quantum difference in terms of damage that's properly liberated out. You're probably talking those ships being out of action for 12 to 18 months. And a lot of them being out of action. Yes, there still might be 2 or 3 available, but what do you need really to counter them? Especially if, as we all know, the ones which were hit were Littorio and Vittorio Veneto. They were the ones which were most likely to get quite heavily damaged to their position because the larger battleships had to be out in the deeper water, so they were actually more exposed to the torpedo bombers. So if the Littorios are the ones which are out for the count, that means you only have really the older battleships. So you possibly have a reversion where it's 3rd Battle Squadron provide whatever heavy units the Royal Navy needs in the Mediterranean, and the French provide the battleships at their end, and maybe you might even end up with Dunkirk being coming across and assisting the Mediterranean fleet. You might end up with Dunkirk moving up to assist other places. But until the Italian Navy is defeated in detail, you won't get any mass movements of these ships. But after they've been defeated, well, that's when you can get options. You might get French ships going back to Britain to be French far ships, i.e. Dunkirk and Strasbourg. One of them could go back and add itself into the British fast squadron for the North Atlantic. There are options. But what you most likely get is the Mediterranean fleet in terms of the Queen Elizabeths and the aircraft carriers are moved out to the Indian Ocean. Now, Djibouti is where I think they head up, which is or Aden. They will end up in one of those 2 ports. So they'll be close enough. They'll be on the western side of the Indian Ocean, but they will be therefore close enough to respond to Singapore if you need to, or get fast deployed air, but also close enough to be in the Mediterranean if you need them. But they're going to be part of the Indian Ocean duties. And that's going to change things. That's going to change things for the Japanese, for example. If we consider if you're making your plans in 1940 and suddenly you know the Royal Navy has a couple of aircraft carriers and 4 or 5 principal battleships, capital ships, sitting in the Indian Ocean, you've got to factor that into your planning. Yes, you could still probably do Pearl Harbor, but your run on Singapore is going to be different. There's also the problem in 1940, this has an impact, of it depends if the French have stayed, if the Indochina has joined Free France. Under this scenario, they might have done, they might not have done. But if Indochina has gone with the Free French, then they're still fighting alongside the British. So if you invade them, you're automatically starting the war against the British. And if you invade them, you're automatically starting the war against the Americans. Because remember what I've always said as that one scenario. If you attack Britain, if Britain's drawn into war in the Far East, the Americans have to join it because they don't want to lose their position to the British. And if you attack the Americans, the British have to join it because they don't want to lose their position to the Americans. So either way, you get both sides involved. And the thing is, for the Japanese in 1940, well, they don't have the Kido Butai. The Kido Butai aren't available yet. They aren't worked up. They aren't in any way available. So you can't start invading in French Indochina in 1940, if they've gone Free French. If they've gone Vichy French, then you can pressure them and you can take it over. But either way, the British now have a far larger fleet sitting in the other side of the Indian Ocean. And again, this is a problem because, well, you can't do a Pearl Harbor on that scenario. Because if you think about it, Pearl Harbor strains your resources, and for that you're going across open ocean where you can hopefully avoid going into confronting anyone or bumping into anyone. Heading down the South China Sea, or even heading down the Pacific and then round Southeast Asia to go avoid contacting with anyone, you'd have to go round the whole of Australia into the Indian Ocean, and then you would have to attack wherever the British fleet is. And the British fleet may or may not be in harbour. That's not really a sensible operation, is it? Schumacher, one interesting downstream effect is that if things aren't lighting on fire every 5 seconds, Wavell would have more time to make sure the people in the Far East were doing their jobs properly. Certainly. IO2, hello IO2. The big question is if the Allies know just how much damage this big Taranto was. The Allies would know fairly quickly. The Allies had fairly good intelligence when it came to Italy. Mostly thanks to Malta and the intelligence flights. So, things have moved. Right then. Scenario 2. And I'm just going to answer some questions or any questions we have on Scenario 1 before I get into it. They speak, then the French-Thai War doesn't happen. There are lots of things which don't happen in this scenario because the French Navy is that big and that powerful. It's enough force that it's basically what the French Navy does is it creates if it isn't there, then it creates a massive strain on the Royal Navy because they have to supply Force H as well as the Mediterranean Fleet, Home Fleet, and Far East. If you have the French Navy, you suddenly have those spare ships to move around. If you have those spare ships to move around, you have more force. You're able to send more force. If we consider the force that's sent to Mers el Kabir, Ark Royal, etc., those things would have been sent to Mediterranean Fleet instead. If you've got Ark Royal, if you've got, as I said, I think Illustrious are probably sent to support the French to give them a carrier to support them. But you might not. There might be the French go, no, we'll use Burn for this, our carrier, and the British go, In which case you could end up with Ark Royal, Illustrious, and Eagle taking part in the attack on Taranto, which is just an obscene amount of aircraft for what the British are planning on doing to attack six capital ships, of which you can only really attack 5 out of 6 of them. But the sheer amount of damage that would be done would devastate that fleet. So, scenario 2. What happens if the French fight on? Now, Melanie, I still want to know who the assistant fluffy researcher knows, because we both know academic board doesn't promote anyone who's not probably connected. To heck with merits. Well, I think he might have made a lot of submissions to the chair of the academic board, which of course was Mum. So, yeah. What can I say? It was unanimous. Even the fluffy research assistant agreed. I did notice he managed to get an extra. He got an extra lump of chicken for his dinner added to his dinner that evening, but I'm not sure who arranged that. Okay. Sav Thompson, if the Free French were supported by the RN in the French Indochina, how quickly could they strike the home islands once word of Pearl hits the wires? Could they beat the IJ at home and level the docks? Probably not, because there probably wouldn't be enough forces there. But they could cause problems, especially if they had submarines, especially if a lot of French submarines had ended up out there. And again, if you have this scenario in North Africa, as we talked about, the odds are you don't have to withdraw all the submarines the British withdraw from the Far East, etc. In which case, you have T-class boats wandering around the Far East when things start to kick off. In the scenarios they were designed for, to be the ambush predators they were designed for in the Far East. Those T-boats are going to have fun. I say, if Indochina doesn't fall, does that delay the fall of Singapore? Yes. We'll get into all this in a bit. So under this scenario, it's different. The French continue fighting. The French don't give in. The German don't sort of, how do I put this? Instead of the emotionally wrought country which survived World War One but at a devastating loss, being shocked and basically awed, blitzkrieg, into thinking it had no choice other than to agree a peace. France fights on. As said, Goring decides to bomb the Eiffel Tower is my scenario, but there are options available to whatever you want to go for. What does this mean? Well, German logistics, when France surrendered, the French agree terms, is already at its extent. It cannot do much more. In fact, it's running out of steam. As we all know, there's the famous stop at Dunkirk, stop before Dunkirk, and there's all sort of myth around it. Oh, it was to give the Allies time to get away because Hitler didn't want to do this and that. No, it's because they run out of fuel. It's quite simple. They run out of the stuff they need to actually move, so they have to stop. And the fact is, the Germans are on a shoestring end of line logistics. Their last mile logistics is going to absolute pot. Their longer range logistics is in, and if it hadn't been for France, actually, the French government, not France, the French government being quite so sure they were lost, the odds are the German military could have found themselves in real trouble. Real trouble. They were not, the Blitzkrieg forces are not designed around fighting a long war. And if you'd had the fight start up again, the Germans could well have been in real trouble. I'm not sure if this ends the war quickly. I don't think it does. But from a naval perspective, if you have that fighting going on, then the odds are the Germans do not get the Atlantic ports. So the Germans don't get the Atlantic ports, okay? That's going to have an impact on things. It also means automatically North Africa, all these places that we've already discussed, stay French. The French Navy stays fighting, so you don't need to do Force H. It changes, of course, the scenario for French Indochina. It changes the scenario for all these things. It is the biggest potential change that you can get. Colin Cameron, are you saying the whole idea of the French redoubt would be impossible? Yeah. The whole idea of the French redoubt is a bit stupid in terms of Brittany, but the rest of France could quite quickly have been a redoubt. In that France has a lot of supplies, a lot of reserves, a lot of forces to call upon. The British Empire British Empire troops are starting to arrive. The war could have gone on in France for a conceivably long time. It wouldn't have been nice. It would not have been good for France, but it would have been worse for Germany. Because this is not the German army that you see in 1942. This is not the German army that invades the Soviet Union. This is the German army of 1939, 1940, and they have even more problems than those later armies do. The German army you see in 1945 is a long way better than the 3940 army. The 3940 army is, I wouldn't call it a paper tiger because it actually does work, but it's a one-trick pony. Its one-trick pony is it's designed around Blitzkrieg. Its air groups, everything is designed around Blitzkrieg. And if it can't do Blitzkrieg because it's at the end of its logistics line and the enemy are strongly built in and are attacking it, it can quite easily find itself cut off. And there are several points where the Germans almost do get cut off. That's the sad thing about the Battle of France. There are several points where the Germans are almost could get through by the skin of their teeth. Either communications fails on the side of the Allies, or the leadership of the Allies reads things wrong and think they're losing when they're winning. Take care, DH89. Duckland 5. Would the French have forces to raid into Chinese or Japanese territories? That's past 41, December 41, so it's going to depend on how things work out. Christopher, does scenario 2 paint a bigger target on Malta sooner? No. Honestly, in all these scenarios, there is a problem for painting a bigger target on Malta. Invading Malta is really not a good idea unless you fancy trying to climb cliffs. Your amphibious assault on Malta is going to be a nightmare, which some people seem to forget every time when they're looking at it. They're going, it's so close to Italy. And B, again, landing aircraft in places on Malta. Malta is really not good land. It's even worse than Crete to bring aircraft down on. And C, the Germans and the Italians do not have heavy bombers. They have a few aircraft which are of interesting distinction, but they do not have a strategic bombing force. And this limits their capabilities. Plus, they're going to be off to using those assets for other things. Adfab, the running troop convoys have become very risky for the Japanese. Nothing like the IJN losing a lot of army troops to engender into service joy. It'd be interesting. But actually, might be a good idea to remind people what the Germans had at the start of the war in terms of land units. I would do, but I haven't got slides for that. I'm sorry. I've concentrated on the naval side. That's also going off into another thing. But I've had this discussion with several very good land warfare historians, ones who specialize in the army and the military side, and they sit there and go, yeah, German logistics is interesting, and German logistics in 1939, 1940 is, frankly, AI 2. I have a feeling this German army would have seen itself defending against invasion by the Soviets in 42, 43. That is also an option, because, let's be honest, they'd be still fighting in France, unless they've agreed a peace deal and withdrawn from France and withdrawn from other territories, because the Allies would only accept them withdrawing from other territories. Then I said, how narrow were German lines on that run down to the Channel? Incredibly narrow. One road narrow at some points. Verdun. People seem to think parachuting onto Malta is a good idea. Looking at the geography, I'm not convinced. Do you ever break your leg landing or end up landing on a fort? Lots of them, and shot at. It's by the locals. Yeah, that's the other thing in Malta. There are some very active and well-armed locals. Excellent. Reading what I do about German logistics, interesting might be kind to them. I try to avoid swearing on the camera. Would stand and allowed an invasion of Germany? That's an interesting thing. It depends what's going on. Remember, Stalin is as much of a how do I put this? A gambler as Hitler is when it comes to taking advantage of situations. I too. If the Toronto raid is successful, I wonder if the UK French naval forces might have been willing to try using several fast cavalry ships to bombard important naval bases in Sicily or the Heel. They might have been, but what do they do it for? If they've already destroyed what they wanted to destroy, why risk the ships to go after those things when they can use them for other things? They still might do it, but anyway. Here's the thing for the Battle Atlantic. There is an entire chunk of the Atlantic which German submarines are not going to reach if you don't have those French bases. I.e., the coast of America. Not going to happen. In fact, you're probably going, because you're now going to be operating and all your subs are going to have to go out probably from Norway or maybe from Germany itself. And even if they're operating from Norway, that's not necessarily as good as it sounds, because you are operating from Norva, far more northern. Yes, you don't have to go all the way round Britain to get out from North Sea and up around Britain to keep a skirt around. You are already out there to head down, but it's still not as good by a long way. It also creates a problem for you in terms of when you start to close the air gap, because what Britain would then at that point need is they need a base in Iceland and a base in Scotland. They need aircraft to be able to fly between the two, especially once they have radar for those aircraft. They would be flying. The submarines could not go the whole way under the sea because that's not what they were built. They're more submersibles than submarines. Let's be honest. These boats, they don't go. They travel around a lot of the world on top of the water because they're not designed to do really the long range underwater. They don't move that fast. They're not really designed with the air systems for that. It's not. Their engines aren't that efficient when they're operating underneath the water. Their battery life doesn't last long, so they have to do a lot of it on the surface. If you've got radar-equipped long-range patrol aircraft flying between Scotland and Iceland, going backwards and forwards, suddenly you have a bottleneck, and you're going to start to lose a lot of submarines in that bottleneck. It's going to have an ongoing impact on your operations. Also, the Bay of Biscay suddenly turns from being a zone which the Royal Navy has to absolutely escort. Remember, that's where they lose escort carriers and all sorts of things in World War II. Goes to a zone of which is fairly safe, because to attack the Bay of Biscay, you have to go out of Norway, down probably past Ireland, and into the Bay of Biscay. That's a long way for your submarine to operate and then come back. It's not going to happen. You also start route. You'd probably see the Western Approaches Command, instead of what they did do, which is as you note in history, they move from operating in the south to operating out of Liverpool because all the convoys suddenly have to go more northerly to keep away from these bases. They'd probably still be operating more southerly. So you probably wouldn't have the move up to Liverpool. In which case, you'd have the convoys coming into the western approaches area, i.e., the traditional sort of Cornwall Ireland route, and going up the Irish Sea to Liverpool and these sort of places. It would change the convoy war dramatically. It would change the risks of the convoy war dramatically. It would change the Battle Atlantic dramatically. It would be far less successful for the Germans. Because, and this is the point, even if you are fighting a war in France, even if you do get to the Atlantic, do you then sit around and spend resources building this, or do you keep on using resources to fight the French who are fighting you and the British troops who are being landed to fight you in France? RG, frankly, it's not like the Germans were going to figure out how to power drop tanks on Malta with attack. It would be interesting to see them try. Nicole Ross. Hello, Nicole. What is the Axis been better off airborne invasion in Malta rather than Crete? No, it would have been worse in Malta. There's an actual command structure and organisation in Malta for them to drop into. Duckland FO, Bay of Biscay was HMS Woodpecker's hunting ground, wasn't it? Yes, it was. And now, of course, also, if you have, it's going to sound strange again, if you have the concentration that the Germans can only come from Norway and not come from France or Germany, only come from Germany or Norway, not from France as well, you suddenly reduce the tasking for your attack groups, your hunter-killer groups, that much more. Because they're going to be up there. The hunter-killer groups, they're also going to be deployed up to that Scotland-Iceland barrier. So you're going to turn that sort of band of water, probably roughly 200 miles wide and the whole distance between Scotland and Iceland, into an absolute danger zone for submarines. Seth Johnson, did the Kriegsmarine ever try to sneak through the Irish Sea? They tried a couple of times, but it was never that good, and they didn't need to because they had the Atlantic. They had these French Atlantic bases, so they don't need to do that. Justin Rollinson, if the Germans don't have Atlantic ports, then where does Bismarck head for? Good point. Well, honestly, if you don't have Atlantic ports, then it's not just Bismarck, it's Scharnhorst and Gneisenau. They also escape back to Atlantic ports. All these ships escape back to Atlantic ports. That's where they're heading for. If you don't have those ports, then they have to get back to Germany through, or at least to Norway, back the way they came. So you burst out a door and then you have to go back through the same door to get back. Where's the Royal Navy going to be waiting? You've just made life dramatically more complicated for the Germans and dramatically easier for the Royal Navy. We've already talked about the effect of the French Navy being joining the British. In this scenario, the Royal Navy suddenly has less area they have to cover, and more importantly, where do they have to put their battleships? Well, all the big battleships can go sit up there they can go sit in Scapa Flow and be waiting. Scapa Flow suddenly becomes just as important as it was in World War One. Instead of the Royal Navy being able to just basically spread around because they could come from anywhere and need to be able to deal with the different axes of a potential attack, they can concentrate in Scapa Flow, which also has an impact on your capital ships getting attacked by German aircraft. Afab, did the convoys change route after the attack had taken them? Yes. Colin Cameron, do you think in scenario 2 we'd see a renewed over barrage to deal with German submarines and U-boats? There'd probably be an attempt to put it in, and where it would actually go to depends on where exactly the Germans have got to. Don Giovanni, we get the GI-UK gap a decade earlier. Exactly. If the USSR keeps supporting the Reich while France is fighting, do we or might we see Operation Pike? Unlikely. Because their support was never active. And the British preferred to keep them a beneficial neutral to the Germans because they weren't that beneficial, rather than as an active participant. This makes a big difference in World War II. I'd say this would be a massive difference in World War II. And going Trius, so the second happy time might not even a thing. Yes. Or for it to be a thing, the German submarines would have had to be even more longer range than they were. They'd have had to use more milk cows, more vessels to support them to get them out there. It'd be an even more complicated, even noisier operation. And that's if they managed to get through that barrier. But nice, if Bismarck survives the first run through the Denmark Strait, then it has to do it again. Then if OTL has played, she'd be joining Hood at the bottom. Yeah. RG, so Scapa Flow would contain a Doom fleet to squash the Kriegsmarine. Yes, which is pretty much what the British have been setting up prior to, at the beginning of World War II and prior to the loss of the Royal Oak. In fact, curious that the Soviets would have controlled German fuel supplies, plus the change. It would have been interesting for the Soviets because if they wanted the Germans to not do anything, they cannot supply them with fuel. Immediately, the Germans still probably get the Romanian oil fields. Now, impact on the Mediterranean of France keep fighting. And France being, well, you now have another option if you're doing an Operation Torch. Because the American troops, if they're coming across to Europe in 1942, well, you can land them in France. They don't need to go any into North Africa. Libya is gone, is taken over as quickly as possible. And much of this happens the same as before. Much of it is exactly the same. However, you now also have another supply route in that you could be supplying forces to, you could still be using Toulon. In which case, the French Navy could quite easily be having to operate from Toulon as well as Algeria. They don't need to withdraw, basically. In which case, actually, conversely, the British will need to send a carrier group and things to support them. But they'll be less important than it had been because they would still have access to the aircraft and supplies in France. And this is another big thing. Remember, this means the French Navy is still able to draw from their own industrial base. If they're able to draw from their own industrial base, that changes the reality of the war. It could mean also Spain is more under pressure, perhaps from Hitler to join war. But as we talked about before, the gentleman who's sent to Spain, Canaris, basically spends his entire time persuading the Spanish not to get involved in the war. So I still don't think they do. But it does mean that Italy could end up fighting a two-front war. If they invade Greece and they're trying to go down there, and the Germans are do the Germans invade Romania? Because if they're still fighting in France, so they have the troops to go and invade Romania. That's debatable. Do the Italians, if they're fighting in France, have the troops to go and attack Greece? Well, actually, he still might do it, especially as he's lost North Africa. He might. Il Duce is stupid enough, he might actually do it. In which case, they could end up with Greece fighting them and no German support. If you have no German support for your operations against Greece, there is a good chance that Greece ends up taking over Albania. So we can think that one through. The Italians might lose not just Libya, they might lose Albania to Greece, and they might start losing parts of, how to put it, certain islands to the French. Going on, with the active participation of French and their historical expertise in nuclear research, could we see an Anglo-French tube alloys project ending World War II in Europe? I doubt it would have done, because whilst that might be a temptation, I don't think it would have gone that way. I don't think it would have ended up. I don't think it would have been that quick, and I think the war might have been over before that could have been done. Especially once America gets involved in a nice way. This is the thing. Imagine a war in Europe where you don't have to do D-Day. You can send supplies directly to France. You can send troops and supplies directly to France. You don't have to build up in Britain. You don't have to train for an amphibious invasion. You don't have to build all those landing craft. You just have to get the troops and personnel to France. That changes World War II. And let's be honest, Operation Torch becomes probably the first wave of reinforcements landing in France. So, yeah. Would they have put more emphasis onto fast merchant raiders like Cormoran, use them to lure the RN off or then send them to a convoy hunt? They might try to, but again, those raiders, etc., would have to transit the kill zone. They would have to transit that part of that patrolled ocean part. In which case, yes, I am a mighty surface raider, but you're a cruiser coming to confront me after being guided in by radar. I'm in a position where I'm not supposed to be, and you're a cruiser with a group of destroyers on a hunter-kill mission. Okay, so I've just been surrounded by 4 destroyers and a light cruiser. There's not much chance of me, the surface, the merchant trader, getting out of that scenario. In fact, there's no chance of me getting out of it. I might, if I'm lucky, take light cruiser with me in a kind of Sydney Cormoran scenario, but the odds are it's not going to happen, because the odds are, under those circumstances, the ship that's going to be getting close to me to board me is going to be a destroyer. So I might take the destroyer with me, which is going to annoy the British, because they don't like to lose destroyers. But I'm not taking a cruiser with me, and there are 3 other destroyers there, which will be filling my hull with torpedoes the moment I start firing on their friend. Stafford, considering the Germans didn't even approach the Japanese about aircraft carriers, which they knew they had no experience of, and the Japanese were pretty much were considered very, very skilled in already by this point. I doubt the Germans would approach the Japanese about I-400 designs when they feel they are the bee's knees when it comes to submarines. You have to remember there is a significant racial element to their approach to the Japanese. RG, also we see French tanks in front of the fall. Mm-hmm. Adfab, wouldn't a rapid loss of Libya unseat Mussolini and thus possibly knock Italy out of the war? There is also that likelihood. I didn't discuss that in the previous scenario because they still won something in Greece under that scenario, in Albania and Greece. But if they lose, I don't think just losing Libya will get him unseated, but I think losing Albania and Greece will probably mean Italy's out the war, which means Germany is then there's no war in the Mediterranean, and you can just concentrate everything on fighting the Germans. Which also means you don't have Operation Husky, you don't have any of the fights in Italy. You'd have no German troops in Italy at this point. I mean, honestly, the Italians might turn around and do a World War I and go, hang on, we're joining the Allied side. We're now fighting for you and invading Germany. So the Germans could well deal with the Italians coming over the Austrian mountains at them. I tell you, French industry gets bombed by medium bombers. German industry gets bombed by strategic bombers and medium bombers. Sounds like a better deal for the Allies. It would certainly be worrying for them. Azaski, if France was still fighting, it'd mean no invasion of Russia. True, there'd be no invasion of Russia, but there'd also be no resupplies or supplies going to Russia. So there's no Arctic convoys to deal with. There's no efforts and supply sending off a load of tanks and other systems to Russia to sustain them. And also, you have no North Africa campaign. So if you think about that, all those the resources you needed to send to North Africa, the resources you needed to send to Russia, etc., would all be going into France. Nicole Ross, if invasion of Italy in 1942, the invasion of Sicily might fail because Italy has 100,000 more troops and all those German supplies and troops also in Africa are available. Potentially, but there's also the fact that Italy might not be part of the Axis, as I said, might be joining the Allies, but also there's going to be a lot of German troops, etc., and resources concentrated on fighting in France. And remember, German logistics is literally built up based off French lorries. A large chunk of German logistics are French lorries built in French factories or taken from France after the fall of France. So after France has to, do what it does, Germany takes a lot of their lorries and turns them into logistics of the German army. I know the French made them particularly terrible and that really impacted their logistics, but they wouldn't even have the limited usability they got of those trucks as it was. So German logistics is going to be still stuck in a lot of problems. Too. Also, Allied bombers get escorted most of the way to the target from French air bases. You would have the fact that Allied fighters would be able to do attacks on German fighters, and it would be a far more interesting dogfight over the German air. Especially once longer range fighters like Mustang, etc., start to enter service. Would we even need the Americans in Europe? I would focus the Americans in the Far East. Back them up. It's Dr. 95, I'm sticking to prior to 1941, so I'm not sticking to the events which happened. I honestly, myself, think that the whole Far Eastern War will be very different. I think the Americans would still join in terms of sending troops to Europe because the Americans would as part of the war. But actually, I don't see Germany declaring war on America under this scenario. I actually honestly don't see Japan wanting to get involved because under this scenario, I would say the chance of Italy declaring itself neutral to be about 50%. The chance of Italy flipping over to the Allies after getting rid of Mussolini, like they actually do in 1943, is the other 50%. Well, about 47% of that, in my mind, when I did some rough maths earlier. And under that scenario, therefore, you have Italy, France, and Britain all sending their troops and invading Germany, all fighting in France and attacking and Italian case probably attacking Germany. There isn't really much chance that Hitler will probably try and fight for a long time, but if German logistics collapses as it can without the chance to rebuild it, post the invasion of France, which is the time they needed. Remember, they invade France, they manage to succeed in operation, and the German army, pretty as in its large part, pretty much doesn't function about for another 12 months. So if they manage to survive, the war could be going on, but I think the war could actually have been over by the end of 1941 in Europe. In which case, this changes the Far East quite dramatically. Because instead of you having a scenario where you have rearming Britain and France, etc., focused on fighting a European war, you have Britain and France with a newly humbled Italy and now allied Italy seeking to show its love for them and support for them after what's gone on. You have no more Nazi Germany. And even if they are still fighting at the end of 1942, they're probably not going to be straining the naval forces, especially not the heavy naval forces of the Allies. In which case, you probably in 1941 have had quite a significant fleet deployed to the Indian Ocean, if not the Far East. In which case, the Japanese will then be dealing with a massive American fleet up in Hawaii and a massive Allied fleet. I myself would not be putting in Singapore. I reckon it might, under this scenario, be put in Ceylon, in Sri Lanka, as we call it these days, but Ceylon at that time, or even Australia, being based up, ready, organized. That's going to have an impact on Japanese operational scenarios because, let's be honest, they can't invade Singapore if they don't take French Indochina first. And whilst the French might not have many ground troops in French Indochina, they will probably have a lot of submarines there and a lot of other things there. So you're not going to be getting supplies through China. So remember, the Japanese land in North French Indochina between the 22nd and 26th of September 1940. And they managed to have an impact on the Burma-China Road in July 1940. Well, if Britain is not back in the wall because France is still fighting alongside it, and they've done better in the European war as they probably would have done in this scenario by this point, because, as said, it's a bit of a bluff on the German part that they look as strong as they do after the fall of France. Then the odds are the British don't close the Burma Road, which means nationalist China is still getting the supplies. And that's going to cause Japan issues. And the army is going to still be dealing with China. Remember, most of the Japanese army spends most of World War II focused on nationalist China and fighting the Chinese. The amount of the army which is deployed for other operations is actually not as big as we think. We always think of fighting the Americans and fighting the British as the primary effort of the Japanese army. It really isn't. They're fighting the Chinese. If the Chinese are better supplied, they're going to be far more busy. In which case, it's a Japanese naval operation. And a Japanese naval operation, well, if Indochina is going to be defended, and if you attack Indochina, you're automatically declaring war on the British. You attack Indochina, then and the French, and it's the French, the British, the Dutch, all of them already allied, organized, and actually committed to defense and working with each other. That changes things dramatically from the Japanese perspective. It turns it into a far nastier war. And it means I don't think the Japanese get to Singapore. I don't think Singapore falls because I don't think the Japanese get there. That's the point. The Japanese would have to get to Malaya, which means they launch from bases in French Indochina, where they have the air bases and all the things. If they don't have the air bases, if they haven't managed to get the troops into Indochina because they haven't managed to secure a position in Indochina, even if they win and get some base positions, they're not going to get all of them. They're going to be fighting, and there's going to be British troops coming out, British Indian troops, and all the troops which, Australian, etc. troops, which might well have also been deployed off to the Western Front to fight in France. But there's also a likelihood that the British Indian Army is no longer having to be deployed to parts of Africa to beat up the Italians in there, and not having to deploy to Syria, etc., to secure areas which might be invaded by German forces getting to there in the Middle East. So you don't have to do the operations in the Middle East. You don't have to do a Madagascar. You don't have to do all the operations you don't want to do, really. Those resources are going to be able to go out here. And they're going to be there. That's going to change the Japanese Japanese mission. And instead of you taking on, it's going to sound strange again. Okay, if you have, as we've always talked about, you have basically an A, a B, and a C team in terms of your roughly structure of your military. You can tell it's A, B, C's. All right, roughly. And we've always said on this channel that, for want of a better phraseology to put it, the best the British had were fighting in North Africa. The next best were providing home defence to the UK after with the threat of invasion, but it was not actual war fighting, not actually fighting. So they sent the ones who were slightly better than North Africa, and the rest of the world kind of got the ones who were not really that. They were slim, etc., and various good officers actually sent out there and available, but they're kind of rare, especially in the early units. If you think about it in this scenario, if you've got fighting going into France, that's where your A's are going. But also that's where your C's are going to provide the numbers. And your B's are probably out in the Far East as your security. So they're just that tad more confident in their roles. Nicole Ross, one of the Far East carriers would have been with the French fleet to give them air cover, potentially. No, Douglas, would one of the Far East? You answered me that. Asked me that a couple once. Don't worry. Malaga, this makes me wonder: what is the chance the USSR eventually decides to attack Germany? Well, there is that potential, but there's also the potential that if they're trying to secure the whole of Poland, that's what they might do, but that could end up with them fighting a war against the British and French themselves. So they might actually decide to withdraw from Poland and try and set up their own, the Free Polish State or something, which it will be a communist state, but technically not Soviet Union, just to try and make it look like it's not occupied territories. The British badly underestimated the Japanese. The British didn't badly underestimate the Japanese. The British just had limited resources. The British did reckon the Japanese were going to do things. They were shocked to an extent by the speed of the Japanese advance. But honestly, if you're the British, where are you? As I've said before, okay, you have a limited number of carriers. Where are you going to deploy them? Yes, if you had another one available, it would probably be before said. But if you don't have that one available, which of the active carriers are you going to strip? The one from the Med Fleet? The one from the Home Fleet? Where are you going to strip that carrier from? And that's the problem for the British the whole time. Where do you strip these assets from? Whereas under this scenario, with the French still fighting alongside the British, you don't have Force H. And as I said, the Mediterranean Fleet probably ends up with capital units deployed in the Indian Ocean at this point, and therefore you have sitting either in the ocean or in Australia. Once Italy, especially once Italy goes neutral or joins, the fleet probably you're talking about in terms of the maybe even the Dunkirk, probably not the Dunkirks. They probably go off to join the force blockading the Germans and keeping the Germans in, and probably that's where the King George V's are. But you probably have all the Queen Elizabeths. You probably have Rodney and Nelson. You probably have Renown, maybe a refitted Hood, sitting out there with 2 to 3 carriers, maybe more, in the Indian Ocean, and maybe sitting as far as Singapore, there as protection. And yeah, the French might even have their own carrier by this point, operational. You never know. They did have carriers under construct. They were considering putting under construction. They were working on carrier designs to follow on from the burn that were better than the burn of Tad. Wayne's what? Which specific lost littoral submarines would the Iron not have suffered? Well, let's put it this way: if you have the Mediterranean War not taking Mediterranean War over very quickly, the odds are all the Barham and all those things which are attacked by German submarines operating in from the Atlantic fleet, from the French Atlantic bases, or all those ones which are damaged by Italians and Italian frogmen, don't happen. So you still lose Royal Oak, probably. That's a given. That's already happened. But you quite possibly you will lose ships in different ways, but you probably don't lose the ships in the same ways. IO2, IJ in the sorry, we weren't planning wars with you guys. Honestly, quickly shoving weapons on the war plans on the carpet. Potentially, but I doubt. I think they'd still end up having to go. Duckland, lol, renowned battle cruisers found it would have had a field day. Certainly enjoyed it if they managed to get involved in some of the actions. Jennifer, so British-French combined fleet split between Colombo and probably Fremantle by the second half of 1941. More than likely. In this scenario, the Allies and the UK and French especially probably be supplying loads more anti-tank weapons and tanks to their forces in the Far East. Potentially. If the Japanese don't get the Singaporean or Singapore don't get to Singapore, then do they get Indonesian oil? That's the thing. If you don't have the springboard, how are you going to get there? It's the thing is they might go through the Philippines, but in nicest way, if we go back to this map, if you look at the Philippines, well, if you don't have French, if you have French Indochina as allied territory, then and Indonesia, then you suddenly have a lot more security to attack the Philippines and to keep pressure up and support the Philippines in terms of the American presence there. That's the reality of it. Ark Royal doing a Taranto to Japan would be interesting. I'm not sure about that at this point, but it would be interesting. Duckland, oh Christ, Monty and Slim on the same front with O'Connor and Wingate as division commanders. Yeah, the Germans would be running. It would be problematic for them. Excellent. The USSR attacking Germany at the time is likely. For the Allied lend these trucks to help them. Soviet logistics are, as Dr. Clarke phrased it, interesting. The Soviets do produce their own trucks, but lend-lease ones are useful. That is a critical amount for especially last-mile logistics. And you must remember there are issues with railways, etc. at this point. The Germans do build a lot of railways the Russians end up using to support their own attack into Germany. Dan Freeman, I rather like the idea of sending Montgomery out to Malaya quite early to give him time to train up the forces there. The man might have been an interesting character and had somewhat of an overinflated ego, especially post-war, but he was a good trainer of men, understood logistics. Basically the opposite of Rommel. Alzaskis, no Force H. Somerville gets sent to Singapore much earlier. Well, this is the thing. Somerville won't get us tired out because he won't be used up running Force H. And you won't need Cunningham to fight the Mediterranean fleet. So actually, it might end up with Cunningham being the one sent out to run. Cunningham might end up being the one running the Indian Ocean Fleet and setting it up, and then Somerville might well succeed in when Cunningham goes and takes over as First Sea Lord. If Cunningham goes and takes over as First Sea Lord, they might decide actually they want to keep him out in the Indian Ocean. So it could end up with Cunningham putting his. It could end up with an actual Yamato trying to take on both Cunningham and, well, I would say Richardson might well survive in that scenario, but he still might end up being succeeded by Nimitz, taking out losing his post Nimitz. Probably still made a scapegoat. So yeah. So it'd be Nimitz and Cunningham versus Yamato. That could be an interesting scenario. And then Somerville would probably take over after him. Yeah. That's interesting. The UK had quite a good picture of Japanese capabilities, but was surprised by how fast it went. Plus, limited and outdated units in the Far East. Americans were the ones who believed Japanese forces were inferior. British were. You have to remember the British. There are factions in the British which certainly do believe the Japanese are inferior, but you also have to remember a large chunk of the Royal Navy's command structure has worked alongside the Japanese Navy in World War One. That gives you an idea of what you're dealing with. And there have been several British sample missions, etc., which had gone out to Japan and had an idea of what they were as capability in terms of people. I think, yeah, why would the IJM be stupid enough to attack the USA if they are really they're already dealing with China, UK, and France? Well, here's the problem, because if they're already dealing with China, UK, and France, if they attack France, then the USA gets involved. So whatever the scenario is, even if they attack, because the Americans can't afford as I've said before, the Americans cannot afford the British and Europeans to humble the Japanese, and for them to be set outside, because then they don't have their position in what they consider the Far East, which they consider their area. Remember, this is still the Americans like to claim they don't have an empire, but very much they do have an imperial mindset, especially at this point. And what Europeans especially call the Far East, and what in America is usually actually more referred to as Asia, Near Asia, and Japan is very much their area. So, well, they won't side with the Japanese if they launched a war of aggression. So, what they would probably, the Americans would declare war in support of the Allies, which is kind of interesting because you could then theoretically have a scenario of the Americans rushing ships to join up with the the Allied fleet, in which case the Americans might end up being component in the Allied fleet rather than being the force commander. It could be, let's put it this way, it'll be some very interesting diplomacy, and all I will say is this: Roosevelt might get his wish and be able to put someone in charge of MacArthur, so MacArthur doesn't get the ego. I.e., MacArthur might be made just a junior, sort of a deputy commander of land forces to the Supreme Land Forces commander, which might be, I don't know, whoever the British have got in charge of the combined British and French have got in charge of the combined alliance forces, until there are sufficient troops sent out there. At which point, well, it might well be Eisenhower sent in charge rather than anyone, so Roosevelt doesn't have to have MacArthur in charge. And you have to remember, the Japanese idea was always they would end up fighting both. So their idea was to knock the Americans out quickly and then knock out the British. That was their plan. That Freeman, sure, Mike. I think it's technically liable against logisticians to imply Rommel might be one of them, even a terrible one. I would probably agree. Cunningham being sent to the east. So, at what point do we build a new column for Trafalgar Square if that happens, or is it just a blimp? It could be interesting. Let's be honest, Cunningham could have fun in the Ocean. Wait, what? One point that hasn't been discussed is the impact of the French Air Force. France has some good combat planes. Some might have been adapted to naval use. There is certainly the potential, but that would be required on a France building its own aircraft carrier and building it up. If France does do that, then they might well have French combat aircraft, but I could see there certainly being a strong argument, and remember the Royal Navy deals with this argument of the French Air Force that any aircraft construction needs to be focused on fighting in the front. And I could see the same happening in the UK with the Royal Air Force going, any friend fighting, any aircraft construction has to be focused on fighting in the front. And the British probably the Royal Navy probably going, yes, but we'll set up a construction factory somewhere in the Far East, which we could then do at that point under those scenarios, to supply naval aircraft for dealing with potentially the Japanese. And it would be an interesting thing. You'd probably be buying a lot of American aircraft, like as you did historically, because the air forces in France and the UK would be going, we're focusing on fighting the on aircraft production is being focused on fighting the Germans on land. So, Harun, the French were introducing a twin-engine carrier plane in 1941. Eh? If that comes across, do we see an earlier Sea Mosquito or Sea Beaufighter? Probably an earlier Sea Beaufighter, and British carrier design might be adapted to reflect that. Slightly larger elevators, lifts, but there again, they might also go with deck edge lifts for it. There were considerations of deck edge lifts, so that would be interesting. Basically, the point of this and the thing I would like you all to take away from it is that any scenario where the French continue to fight is going to be a very different scenario than if they don't. Any scenario is going to change the world dramatically. And you also have to remember this is the scenario the British were built for. If you had turned around to even Admiral Henderson in 1936 and told him that in 1940 the French would collapse because their government psychologically defeated by the speed of the German advance, and that there would no longer be the French Navy, French territories, French Army, French Air Force fighting alongside Britain versus the Germans, he would have laughed at you. If you'd added on that Norway would have also fallen, he would have looked at you and gone, what are you talking about? How would that happen? It is the absolute. It's not even the worst case envisaged scenario. It's the worst case nightmare scenario for the Royal Navy, for Norway to fall, and for France to fall. And on top of it all, to lose the French Navy. Because they'd been, first of all, when Norway fell, that was a shock. Then, when France looked like it was going to fall, they were under the impression the French Navy was going to carry on fighting with them, that they were going to come on and fight with them and continue to fight and continue the war, that the Free French would be their naval allies. And then they don't. And that's the scenario for Britain. It's just shock after shock after shock. And this is a likely scenario. These scenarios are the likely scenarios of what happens if that doesn't happen. If the French Navy itself continues fighting on as it goes all Free French, or if France just doesn't fall, if they refuse to submit and they keep fighting, this is what we're dealing with. It's a very different world, a very different war than the one we studied the history of. I too. France, UK. We now have aircraft production set up in the Far East to reinforce our air forces in that area. The Japanese attack. Well, how lucky that we now have that new factory set up there. Honestly, the Britain were looking at setting up factories in India or in Ceylon, Australia. It would have been interesting. No, Churchill never declared that Britain would never be at war with Japan. There is sometimes a myth which goes around, but it's complete utter it's not true at all. In fact, Churchill was often worried about the fighting the Japanese. The Japanese were were quite high up on his friend list. In the early 1930s, they were who he was really worried about. And with the rise of Nazi Germany, yes, he was worried about the Germans, but he was still worried about the Italians. Henderson must have had some time for the fall of France in the next war, after they made it 90 miles to Paris before. They had plans for issues turning up in France, but remember, they made it 90 miles to Paris, but France had not fallen. So if you're looking at it from that scenario, France had suffered a massive battle and a massive fight, but they hadn't fallen. And that's the point. Why is it always telling me I have to insert ads? I don't like inserting ads. Mm-hmm. Because of money. Yeah, more than likely. Actually, I do get told off on honestly, and this is a scary thing I will tell you about. I was having a chat with my bank manager recently, sorting things out, making sure my accounts are okay. You know, as you do. You're supposed. It's a good idea, by the way, for those of you who don't know. This is something which was my grandfather always passed on to me, and my grandfather was a bank manager in the age when there was only one person in the bank who had the title of manager, and he ran a big branch of a national bank in a fairly large town suburb of London. So he knew what he was talking about. His view was you should always make sure you schedule a discussion of your accounts with your bank manager every 4 months to check in with them, check you're in the best account, most suitable to you, and check everything is above board and working fine and they're happy with you. And so I do that. Every 4 months or so, I have a chat with my bank manager. And my bank manager was talking about my credit rating. And he said, yes. Well, you see, you've been getting these regular sums coming in from, yes, YouTube and Patreon. So we've improved your credit rating. And I'm going, you do, you, um, um, so the work I get from different universities hasn't improved my credit rating. No, because as we both know, they sometimes forget to pay you what they're supposed to pay you for months on end. Yes. However, the regular Patreon and YouTube have been so good at supporting you, and yes, the money goes through because you spend it on your research and going out doing these things. But it's been so good at supporting you and so kind. Yes, we've improved your credit rating by 25 points, which is thank you to all of you. So that's that. Heads up. Make sure you check your account out with your bank manager on a regular basis, about every 3 to 4 months. And thank you again for all your support, because without the support, without the super chats, without super thanks, without Patreon, without Ko-fi, without PayPal, without all the stuff you all do, without buying from the Spreadshirt store, which should be a banner down below about, I wouldn't be able to do all this. I certainly wouldn't be getting the new tower unit, so that will hopefully allow me to improve the videos. And I certainly wouldn't be able to do the level of research I have been able to do. In fact, I'd probably have had to give up being a researching historian. There's honestly a good chance the book, The Trial Battles and Airings, wouldn't have got completed because I wouldn't have had the time to be able to complete it. I'd have had to leave academia. I'd have had to leave doing any historical research at all. I'd have had to go and probably, well, either train as a teacher, which would be quite a fun one, or go and work as an analyst for a bank, which is what quite a lot of my colleagues ended up doing. I've had to do neither. I don't mind. I do enjoy. I do teach school-age children quite often. With thanks to Justin Craig, I enjoy doing it. But honestly, I prefer to avoid the paperwork because they get far more paperwork than university lecturers do. But yeah, it's all thanks to you. So thank you. I get to do this. I get to still be a naval historian. I get to still do the research, write the books, do the work I'm doing and I love because of your support. And as bonus, my credit rating's gone up. Thank you. Vision. I've never talked to my local bank manager, but all the ladies there know me, and they have loaned me money several times. If it whatever works for you. Thanks, well. The British had factories in India. I'm a proud owner of a 1926 Lee Enfield rifle built in Ashurpur, India. Just not enough. Exactly. They wanted to build more. And I probably would have. Since we've mentioned the RN, just got to ask, was the deck design used on Royal Navy battlecruisers like Renown, Repulse, and Hood a broken or flush deck? Broken, I think. They're not all one level, so I think they're broken. I think broken. But now you put me on the spot. I'm now trying to remember the definitions of broken and flush, and that's not appearing in my head. That's right. So, well, it's one of those lines that's twaddle, but being peddled so much it's been true. Yeah, but great cost, so suspect of foiling to be high, had to be high. The thing is about Churchill is he does say so much. It's very easy to put a lot of other words in his mouth, but he honestly didn't. He wasn't as stupid as sometimes is made out. He wasn't as smart as is sometimes made out. He was in between, and he was good at what he did. He was not good at all some of the other things. It's like under this scenario, you probably do not have the Bengal famine. Why do you not have the Bengal famine? Because you aren't losing as many merchant ships in the Battle Atlantic. If you're not losing as many merchant ships in Battle Atlantic, you're not having this strain put on the merchant vessels in the Indian Ocean. You're not also having a war being fought in the Indian Ocean because the Japanese are unlikely to get anything in there. So the merchant vessels in the Indian Ocean are probably going to be operating fine and safe. In which case, the pre-war supply lines and logistic lines will probably still keep going, which will be fine, which means food will move from where it is to where it's needed in India. The fact is that it is British colonial problem that colonial authorities which are at fault for that, but it's not Churchill. It's the ones who for years haven't built the right railway lines, because the fact that Bengal is still dependent upon the sea for getting all the supplies from one side of India where there was plenty of food to the other side of India where there was not enough food is absolutely absurd, because there's food spoiling on one side of India and there's not enough food on the other side, and there's no way to get it between because they're dependent upon ships and the ships aren't there. And that is a terrible thing. There should have been a railway line. There should have been. And that is you. Churchill gets the blame because he's the guy in charge of Britain at the time. But honestly, it's not him. It's generations before him, because in a nice way, building a railway line in the middle of World War II in India probably didn't occur to the British. And wouldn't have been a quick fix. But yeah, 1920s and 30s, they should have built a railway line. In 1900s, they should have built a railway line. In the 1890s, they should have built a railway line. There are lots of times they should have built a railway line, and they didn't. Thank you, KVG. I will check it in a bit. I know it's a bit off topic, but can you do a tour of your new setup when you've built your new tower? Yes, you'll get a tour of the setup. You'll also get probably. I'm considering doing at least a short video, a sort of one of those many pictures taken sort of video of me building the tower unit and putting it together. Thanks, Wayne. It is coming up on 3 years now. It's kind of worrying. Thank you. That's Aaron. Battleship New Jersey is doing a vid about it tonight. Flush and Broken Deck and the difference between them. Cool. That'll be a good video. I'll watch that probably tomorrow. And the reason I say probably tomorrow is because probably tonight I think I'm going to be dealing with the issues of family life. Oh well. Cameron, we need to see if we can get Doc and Iron Brew sponsorship. Imagine the savings on his drinks bill. Oh, that would be. It's now £2.50 a bottle. Seriously, that's an average of a. I've cut it down. I'm being good. I'm back in the gym. I've cut down the Iron Brew. It's £12.50 worth of Iron Brew a week now. 5 bottles, not 7. Thank you, Go Lander. They are frigating pricey, Go Lander. They are. The first British capital ships built with the flush decks were no rods. All early ones have split level main decks. Yeah, they've broken, I think. The premiere is 12 a.m. UK time. Okay, so that is tomorrow. Well, I have actually worked out what I'm getting. If I can open up. Oh, I'll do it on my phone. I know it's rude to check your phone while talking live, but it's easier for me to check on the phone than overload the poor internet bar. Well, the poor laptop by looking up Amazon whilst I'm on doing this. So let me just quickly check that. Yeah, I'm getting what I've gotten currently is an ASS Co Nvidia 3060, which has RTX 3060, which has a 12 gigabytes of GDR6 currently listed, and yeah, that it looks a good one for me. It looks like it's good and it'll do the work it's supposed to. It has a GPU clock speed of 1882 megahertz, and it has all the HDMI ports and things I'm looking for, so that's good. I think it's a good one. I've read the reviews of it. I'm quite happy with it. From looking at it, it looks like I wanted one which was a reliable one, not necessarily the fastest out there, but a reliable, solid one which would do all the work I needed it to do. It's also about £400, so. And so I'm going to say final questions, as it's now been 3 hours and I've got to go walk fluffies. So, any final questions? And thank you for watching. Hope you enjoyed. So anyway, I wanted to build a new PC this generation, and there is a good chance it'll be an AMD GPU. Mine's going to be definitely an AMD processor. It's all set up AMD. I tend to build with AMD because I find them more. How do I put this? I like Pentiums, but AMDs tend to be more rugged, in my experience. The frame rate is pretty bad. It's supposed to be running at 30 frames per second, so hopefully it's keeping up with that, but you never can be quite sure. How long does Turpit survive? Not that long if she's in Norway. if the Royal Navy is able to concentrate as it is in that scenario. Might still hide out in Norway for most of the war, but also there's a thing: is does the Tirpitz actually get finished? Does Bismarck even get finished under this scenario? If the Germans end up in a stalemate fighting in northern France and in France in general, and are slowly pushed back from there, do they finish it? Anyway, thank you very much, everyone. It's 3 hours, and I have just been messaged and going beep. It's not keeping up on it. I'd say it's dipping below 3 frames per second at places. I wonder why. They're still saying excellent connection, but there's a potentiality that there are issues with that. And I am seeing myself go a bit weird, so I'm not sure what's happening on that front. I'll have to sort it out. I'm hoping a lot of these things will be fixed by the new tower unit. Thank you very much, Aaron. Should I go, Glenn? Already pulled the trigger on the components? No, as I said, I'm waiting for the last paycheck to come in this week. It was supposed to be with me today, but I'm presuming it's going to arrive tomorrow. Thank you, Aaron. Take care. Mercy Legend of after a war where France get fighting and Mediterranean is over super quick, Italy changes sides. This leaves a far stronger Britain and France post that war and likely won't be as US influenced. It would be interesting. Let's put it this way. The world would be interesting. But you still would be dealing with a Soviet Union, which might well be building battleships under this scenario. In which case, there could well be an interesting scenario going on in Europe. But, again, the Soviet Union won't have had the chance to conquer Eastern Europe. And you won't have technically the Cold War turn out like it was. So it could be a very interesting 20th century. Take care, everyone. Thank you for watching. And running at 720 instead of 1080 might help with that. Potentially. But we'll see. Take care, everyone. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope you enjoyed. Bye. Thank you, Go. I will consider it. The trouble is, I want to get it done soon, so I have something to work with.